And let us confess our faith today in the words of the Sparkle Creed. I believe in the non-binary God, whose pronouns are plural. I believe in Jesus Christ, their child, who wore a fabulous tunic and had 2 dads, and saw everyone as a sibling child of God. I believe in the rainbow spirit, who shatters our image of one white light and refracts it into a rainbow of gorgeous diversity.
In my introductory video, I painted the picture of the mass delusion our culture is sliding into. I claimed that our madness is due to the narrative worldview called dialectic that academia presents as the truth. The more we adapt it, the more we derange ourselves. Because this video is about the engine of the whole worldview, it will be an exception and be longer than the rest. I will make a short 15-minute summary soon. In this video, I want to focus on the assumptions underlying dialectical worldview rather than focus solely on its technicalities. Once we understand the central assumptions, we will better see if technical gymnastics used in it serve to conceal core mistakes or are actually correct. Think of the geocentric solar system. As long as the central assumption about the sun moving around the Earth was wrong, the Ptolemaic system was usable but required ever more elaborate equations to conceal a mistake. Only when the sun was moved to the center of the solar system, the overblown calculations could be dispensed with. We have the same situation here. Once we understand what is the structure of this worldview, we will know if the complexity of specific parts announces genius or, as would Nietzsche say, masks the weaknesses and pathologies of its creators. So what is dialectic? Normally we would state dialectic is a type of conversation where 2 people holding opposing views try to reason to a logical conclusion. As a philosophical method, it is a study of the unity of opposites or a way of finding the corresponding truth in 2 contradictory propositions. Most often, it is depicted as a triangle of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It is sometimes called speculative, from the Latin speculum, which means mirror because it bounces and reflects statements of opposing positions. Examples of dialectic are the following sentences. Fire burns. It is dangerous. And fire is good. It gives warmth and purifies. A dialectical synthesis would be, the dangers of fire can be tamed and used to heat people and food. Triads like this can be built with any number of sentences, and even with single words as in the famous example of being, nothing, and becoming. You can also create sequences of dialectical statements. Here, dialectic doesn't look scary nor threatening. Certainly, nothing that would announce the disintegration of a whole civilization. Dialectic claims to be logical, rigorous, well-established, and throughout the ages has played an enormous role in Western thought. We might end at that, pack up, and go home. But then we find following statements from the godfather of dialectics, Hegel. Speculative, dialectical truth, it may also be noted, means very much the same as what, in special connection with religious experience and doctrines, used to be called mysticism. All the categories of dialectical logic may be looked upon as definitions of the absolute or metaphysical definitions of God. It is of the highest importance to ascertain and understand rightly the nature of dialectics. Wherever there is movement, wherever there is life, wherever anything is carried into effect in the actual world, their dialectic is at work. It is also the soul of all knowledge which is truly scientific. After reading that, we pause. It doesn't fit. It doesn't make sense. So we look at the dialectical triad again. And now we notice that this synthesis is a kind of movement that transforms the lower into a higher form. This little word movement is key to understanding what is happening. As a technical construction, dialectic doesn't seem complex. But if you frame it as describing movement, and as Hegel said, apply it to reality, not just linguistics, it becomes much more. That movement necessitates more general questions like, where does this movement come from and where does it lead to? What is at the end of it? Does it mean that the movement has stages? What is the relation of each stage to the subsequent one? Are they connected? Are the seeds of higher dimensions captured in lower ones? Are lower ones some kind of shades of the higher ones? If dialectic regards reality, at which stage are we? And finally, if this movement exists, what is its engine? Is it a negation that provides a purifying force, melting distinctions and producing synthesis? We can see that dialectic necessitates its own teleology, which means purpose, and answers to those questions encompass wide and fundamental inquiries and can be viewed as a worldview. When we add the third dimension, the purpose and ultimate direction to the movement, the dialectical frame is sometimes symbolized as a spiral revolving around a single axis, drawing everything toward that final conclusion. So after that, and after reading claims about mysticism and movement, we have a choice. We can either believe academics who say that dialectics is only about the triad, and the mysticism was a slip of the tongue, forget about it, and leave them to their devices. Or we can say that the lady doth protest too much, and try to get a peek behind the curtain. To do that, we need to begin with what the claim about mysticism refers to, Hermeticism. Hermeticism was an ancient religion adopted by the Greeks from Egypt. Its beliefs are captured by its 7 core principles. The principle of mentalism interprets reality as a lower reflection of a higher dimension, a divine mind that permeates the whole of existence. The principle of correspondence, or as above, so below, claims those levels form an interconnected whole. Lower ones contain seeds of higher levels. Because laws and patterns between levels reflect one another, what happens on one level influences others in the same way. The principle of cause and effect, the law of attraction, asserts that every event and action attracts corresponding effects capable of transforming other dimensions. It emphasizes that we are active participants in creation. The mind is seen as a bridge between the physical and spiritual realms and has the power to shape and transform reality using intentionality. The principle of vibration holds that everything is in a state of constant motion, and different levels of vibration correspond to different levels of matter and consciousness, different degrees of the ultimate. The principle of polarity, or differences in degree, states that everything has 2 opposite aspects. Polarities are not absolute but exist on a spectrum, with varying degrees of quality or intensity. You may think of water, which with an increase in temperature heats, but only after a certain point it changes to vapor. The principle of gender holds that everything in the universe has both masculine and feminine aspects or energies. The principle of rhythm holds that everything in the universe operates according to cycles and patterns, and understanding these rhythms is essential to understanding the order of reality. Together, the principles of Hermeticism are represented by the symbol of the single eternal substance devouring and recreating itself, a snake eating its own tail, the Ouroboros. The name of this religion comes from the god Hermes, an equivalent of the Egyptian Thoth. This character elegantly symbolized mentioned principles. He was associated with movement and speed, a messenger of the gods, as well as the one who transported souls between realms of reality, from the material world to the world of the dead. Therefore, he was the god of boundaries and was often depicted at the crossroads. His attribute was a caduceus, which depicts 2 fighting snakes indicating opposing forces of chaos. However, the snakes, according to the Greeks, were seen also as a symbol of wisdom and healing. Therefore, on the rod, they are intertwined and balanced. The caduceus, therefore, was a symbol of political ambassadors and healers. Hermes was also the god of thieves, those who access locked and unobtainable valuables. As a god, he alone was able to access what was hermetically sealed. Lastly, he was a prodigy of a god of ingenuity who could craft and deliver wonderful new things. We see how those symbols align with the principles of the religion, promising access to the divine, transcending barriers, underscoring the balance, and healing unification of opposites, and recovering what was locked and unobtainable to get something new and valuable. In ancient times, Hermeticism had a great influence. For example, we see its echoes in Plato, in his cave, where people are trapped and can only see the shadows of the real, in his bronze, silver, and gold souls that are imbued with varying degrees of the divine. We can see it in the philosopher king who placed the top of the state reflecting the purest vision upon society by means of politics. Hermeticism also influenced other religions, for example, Judaism through Kabbalah or Christianity, where it inspired the Gnosticism. Here it claimed that Christianity is a lower reflection of the true meaning of religion. Everything was flipped, inverted, and repurposed while still retained its identity. Gnostics posited that the Abrahamic God was only a lower deity behind whom there is the true ultimate God. The Abrahamic God was painted as evil and seen as a creator of a prison, the reality that bars us from the absolute God. The serpent in the Gnostic story is portrayed as good. He is the one offering us an escape from the cage of Eden through knowledge of right and wrong. Here, Gnosticism uses Christian features and reframes material reality not only as a lower dimension, but as sinful and evil. Through the inner light of the divine, true, revealed knowledge or gnosis, man can see through the veil that is this reality and begin initiating himself toward the absolute by rejecting and transcending the layers of the fallen material world. For this process, Gnosticism offered a wide range of spells and amulets as tools for correct magical synchronization with higher planes. Those examples reveal that among Hermetic poetic pictures are hidden a couple of worrying characteristics. Hermeticism devalues natural reality as it considers it only a shade of something more real and true. As a consequence, it flips the order of what is true and false or good and evil. Secondly, because those dimensions are intertwined with one another and contain seeds of ultimate, it sees man not only as a part of nature or God's creation, but himself as a shard of the absolute mind. Here, it forms a really narcissistic image of man capable of tuning himself to his divine spark and comprehending the divine mind. Not only approaching it, but literally possessing it and understanding. To make it more radical, it proposes that this knowledge gives man a direction and the ability to reshape lower reality to fit this image. Thirdly, it is parasitic in nature because it considers everything in existence to be a lower reflection of the divine. Now, the enlightened one will take it over and redirect anything towards its real purpose, synchronizing it with his own vision, be it art, society, knowledge, etc. Fourthly, the process of transformation often requires discarding what doesn't fit the ideal. Here, rejection doesn't mean destruction, but purification and healing. A magical change of the nature of the entity to reveal its higher identity. Because of those features, areas of life that it parasitized were trying to fight it off. Philosophers like Aristotle formulated principles like that of non-contradiction to constrain claims about magical transformations. Christianity detached itself from the parasite and considered Gnosticism a heresy. But then came the most powerful remedy, forgetting. As Rome collapsed, it took away institutions, stability, and education. Most ideas disappeared, and most texts faded. Knowledge and magical practices of Hermeticism retreated through Byzantium to the Arab world where they adapted to the new environment and latched on new disciplines. Just like Gnosticism, it leached to Islam and influenced Sufism, a mystic twist on Islam. In the West, 1,000 years passed until the Renaissance came. Learning began anew with the rediscovery and translation of many long-forgotten gemstones of literature. On the Nature of Things by Lucretius, the Architectura by Vitruvius, Letters of Cicero, and the Histories by Herodotus. Some of the texts of the giant of philosophy were found. Plato, of whom it is said that the whole of philosophy is but a series of notes to his ideas. Plato's works were being copied at the center of the Renaissance, the court of Florentine Il Magnifico. But before the copier could finish, he was ordered to stop and focus on a newly discovered, and even more important text, Corpus Hermeticum. Hermeticism detonated a bomb in the European philosophical milieu. However, because it wasn't an ancient word, it had to adapt again to this new environment where new ideas, new states, religious reformation, and the Gutenberg press were thriving. Hermetic perspectives got reinstated with concepts like Prisca Theologia, one true ancient theology whose shards are ingrained in the knowledge of all other disciplines and religions. From the Arabic world was imported alchemy, a face Hermeticism put on in that culture. Here again, the reality was a lower dimension of higher divine consciousness. The universal mind was reflected in all aspects of creation. Alchemists, therefore, sought the ultimate material, the philosopher's stone. They attempted to recover the essence of the material, trying to purify it. Alchemists tried to transform the lower, base metals like lead into their hidden, higher and pure form, gold. They also believed in the possibility of healing the mortal, dying body with an ultimate essence, the elixir of life. Before the clear and rigorous methods of science, many thinkers blended those ideas with more naturalistic ones. For example, Isaac Newton spent 1/10 of his writings on alchemy, and his death was hastened because, in search of eternal life, he injected mercury into his body. Mercury, of course, is a Latin translation of Hermes. As alchemy was gaining popularity in philosophy, many other disciplines and organizations adopted Hermetic teachings. For example, Freemasons were originally the Stonemasons Guild, but during the Renaissance, they increasingly turned into a secret society, practicing rituals and utilizing magical symbols, initiating members into a wider, esoteric understanding of existence and ways of transforming it. But in this new, vibrant age, many other ideas were created. Universities and scientific societies grew. The pursuit of knowledge led thinkers down the paths that rivaled alchemy and mystical beliefs. Although in the beginning they intertwined, they would increasingly grow apart, focusing on naturalism. With the work of Francis Bacon, the seed of Enlightenment science was planted. He proposed to formulate methods to counter the suggestibility and fallibility of our senses, or what he called idols of tribe, cave, marketplace, and theater. According to him, these expressed our tendency to generalize and see patterns that don't exist, personal biases and prejudices, imperfections arising from communication and uncertain language, and belief in authority without examining it. Bacon argued for a method that would not paint vast speculations about reality, but focus on clear categorization and examining and accumulating small but stable truths. In time, this body of knowledge would become enormous because it would not require reorganization of its fundaments like most other philosophies which are based on misguided assumptions. Down that road, searching for unshakable fundamental truths, claims like the famous Cartesian cogito ergo sum were formulated. As the methods that focused on certainty, first principles, and safeguarding against bias grew, David Hume posited a distinction between ought and is, which meant that however precisely we describe something, we can't derive moral judgment about it. From the knowledge of the temperature of the fire, it doesn't follow whether it is good or bad or what should we use that fire for. In the end, the Enlightenment developed a general prize of reason and science as the best tools humankind possesses and often stated overreaching and prideful claims about man's ability. The universe was now at man's command if only he could master its rules. At the end of the 18th century and the height of its glory, the Enlightenment began to gather critics. The detailed categorization and minute particularizing of laws and elements seemed unnatural. Mechanistic principles of reality and the objectivity of its laws announced a lack of guiding spirit in them. Science was overtaking not only human sensibility but also religion as the chief way of answering questions: how things work, how to organize them, and which effects come from which causes. Even social order became increasingly not a reflection of godly order but of a social contract and political forces. These trends were best expressed in the thoughts of two individuals. Jean-Jacques Rousseau lamented increasing categorization, which didn't produce wisdom, but only answers. For him, a man in a natural state lived on his instinct and was guided incorruptly by natural drives. By the fact that he started to categorize, he came to see distinct options and value those which were serving his interests, not only his needs. As soon as he began interacting and exchanging things he valued, the game of competition came, which resulted in domination. Rousseau saw man imprisoned under social rules that were legitimized by reason. Even though he didn't have the language, he was recreating the same story we saw earlier. He saw a true natural man's fall with the categorization and distinction. This fall alienates man from his true nature and imprisons him in society with its artificial norms that serve oppression. The spark of gold, of true essence and wisdom that needs to be completed, is in emotionality, and reason should be subservient to that higher impulse. However, his ideas differed in one significant way from the mystic story. Now the prison and the route of escape was a social and collective concern where previously it was an individual journey. Ideas of Rousseau hugely influenced the French Revolution, which attacked social prison and the ancient regime. From this era, we have a meaning of the world for political left, which marks this impulse of breaking out of social constraint. During the French Revolution at the General States, the people who sat on the left of the king would oppose the current social order and would subsequently break it during the Jacobins' reign of terror, establish new laws and a new calendar. During their era of brutality and fraternity, the goddess of reason was dancing on the altar of religion in Notre Dame. Soon after that, Immanuel Kant, a great admirer of Rousseau, was thinking about similar things but in a much more systematic way. Driven by Hume's ought and his distinction, he sought to rescue religious purpose from the mechanistic reality. As a great systematician, he crafted a body of philosophy in which he was determined to make room for an ideal sphere illuminating us. He criticized the ability of human empirical senses to truly know the nature of things, and argued that they are influenced by innate concepts and forms of understanding that he referred to as the transcendental aesthetic and the transcendental categories. One of his greatest contributions was to formulate moral dictums of categorical imperative, with which he tried to derive ought from is. Although the Hermetic or even Gnostic impulse can be heard in Rousseau, there is no reason to think he was consciously recreating a mystic story. Kant was a great hero, both of Enlightenment and Idealism, and one of the greatest systematicians who hardly had any interest in mysticism. But we see how Kantian claims about a higher realm of ideals, Rousseau's fall of the natural man to social oppression, and a feeling of inner truth can be tempting to actual mystics. And so it happened that in the part of Germany especially fond of mystical and alchemical beliefs, grew G.W.F. Hegel. His favorite philosopher was the renowned mystic Jacob Boehme, and Hegel himself was a theologian who only later turned to philosophy. He was charmed by Rousseau's ideas and belonged to the Jacobin Club. It was he who undertook to formulate a system that would hammer those inclinations together into an idealistic system of dialectics. In this part of video, I will go through many authors, but in the interest of time, I won't read all the quotes, but I will show them on screen. You can pause to see and verify if what I am describing is supported by the references. Hegel as a magician began by substituting what we call natural and logical laws with dialectical laws. These, he claimed, are a true and better logic and science of nature. In reality, he transported us to the realm of linguistics. His philosophy recreated the story answering all the questions we asked in the beginning and heard echoes of in Hermeticism. For Hegel, there was a God of reason, the absolute ideal, spirit, or consciousness. This God was pure freedom, perfect, whole, uncontradictory, and united, encompassing the entirety of reality. Here we hear an echo of the Hermetic principle of mentalism. However, the perfect ideal lacked one thing: self-knowledge of its own perfection. Its own perfection was incomprehensible to it because it was perfect in relation to what? Therefore, the absolute idea sort of contracts and makes room for practical representation in which it reflects itself. Religious people will recognize this as a fall from heaven. Only now can the practical idea be compared to the theoretical idea. For Hegel, therefore, the dialectical triad reflects movement from the ideal realm to practical representation, an abstract idea and the negation that allows the idea to become concrete, practical. For Hegel, the entirety of history is a movement by which this absolute God of reason will be completed, his idealistic form rejoined with the practical one, which means the realization of pure freedom. Before that happens, reality and the epochs of history exist as a lower reflection, a dimension that is only a shade of the absolute but contains seeds of it ingrained within. Here, we hear the Hermetic principle of correspondence. Forms of this reality, removed from the absolute, are therefore imperfect. States of consciousness and ideas are not united and contradictory, leading to clashes. This element is described as his famous master-slave dialectic. When two consciousnesses clash, one inevitably dominates the other, which begs for mercy. The winner imposes their view of consciousness on the other and makes it work to reflect the master's vision in reality. The slave, therefore, externalizes through their work not their own consciousness, but the master's. However, the master and slave are in a dialectical relationship and are therefore interconnected, meaning that to truly be a master, the master requires recognition and affirmation from other consciousness. Now the master is dependent on the slave's affirmation and work. He remains the master as long as the slave recognizes their subjugation and delivers to him the fruits of his work. Here, everything flips, and the slave is the one in control because it is he who controls nature and provides the master with recognition. This tension cannot last and will produce a clash that requires resolution dialectically, producing an adjusted form of relation. We hear here the Hermetic principles of polarity, rhythm, and gender. However, the state of world consciousness, world spirit, is not reflected by the single relation of two individuals, two consciousnesses. Every person and millions of them are in this sort of dialectical relation throughout the world. The spirit is therefore the overall state of these relations, the web of social laws and norms, the Geist. And this general Geist is personified in the tangible form of the state. Therefore, Hegel would say that the state is a divine idea as it exists on earth, which, for Christians, would mean God's Son Jesus. The absolute idea is God, and Geist or culture is equivalent to the Holy Spirit. Each person is placed in this level of reality, this step toward the end of history. Each human is submerged in the current form of spirit and conditioned by it, and therefore Hegel believed that man is only a tool of history and owes the God of state his complete devotion. Motivation for change in transcending the current state for normal people comes from pathos, from a feeling of being displaced and unhappy. Pain and discontent negate and generate energy for movement, but it is not evident to all. When we are immersed in the Geist, the specific moment of history and society, and we feel those different emotions, when we see the particular forms that seem to oppose one another, they seem unconnected to our eyes. The way to make sense of all these struggles, clashes, and contradictions is by comprehending not their form, but their nature in a historical movement. Each form, as it contradicts one another, is but a freeze frame of the overall movement, and each epoch is a phase of the movement toward the absolute. Therefore, Hegel names his opus magnum Phenomenology of the Spirit. Here, the concept of holistic thinking comes into play, revealing the true uniting nature of opposites by interpreting them from an elevated plane that sees the purpose of each element not as an individual, but as part of an interconnected, moving whole. Here, the philosopher and theoretician echo the Hermetic narcissism of seeing the plan of the divine mind. In terms of dialectic, one can think of a distinction between a circle and a square. Dialectician has access to another dimension and views those forms as artificial contradictions because only he knows the true nature of those forms, a cylinder. Hegel describes this as Vernunft, true, elevated knowledge of the nature of things, the knowledge that is above mere Verstand, which means understanding things as they are. And this magical trick he calls a real science, the science of the movement of contradiction. Only here do we come back to the ordinary dialectical triad. Hegel places it as a vehicle of the movement transporting us through history toward the absolute. And to finish this triad, to generate the movement from negation, he presents the word obver. He obsesses over it because, in German, it is itself dialectical. It means at once to destroy, to preserve, and to lift. He imagines a process that discards what was inadequate while simultaneously keeping the essence of truth and elevating it while joining it with the corresponding truth of the negation. I hope you hear how alchemical this word is, transforming and purifying higher essences trapped in lower material. After this story, we can see that, just like mystics in the principle of mentalism saw the divine mind, Hegel believes in absolute consciousness, God, the ideal permeating all reality. He sees history and its epochs similarly to the Hermetic principle of correspondence, where levels of reality are connected and intertwined. He sees us trapped in a lower, incomplete level of history and reality that was alienated from the absolute spirit. But he sees man participating in the process of movement of purifying it by uncovering hidden essence. We see here principles of cause and effect and of vibration. This movement is part of a greater plan in which the contradictions are revealed as artificial clashes and moves by transforming societies, states, and the ages of history. These assertions resemble principles of polarity, gender, and rhythm. The whole of Hegelian system bears a strong resemblance to mystical Ouroboros, even in his own words. Dialectical science exhibits itself as a circle returning upon itself, the end being wound back into the beginning, the simple ground, by the mediation. The system that Hegel built brought him renown and international recognition. His ideas produced many subsequent currents, not least because they were incomprehensibly written. He found many followers, one of whom was, amongst the so-called young Hegelian, young Karl Marx. But Marx had his own beliefs that he hoped dialectic could serve. As a materialist, he focused on earthly concerns like money and goods. Hence, his method became dialectical materialism. As a materialist, Marx hated religion with special fervor. His method was therefore designed to displace God from the center of the universe and place there a man. He believed that religion only created illusions that distracted man from focusing on himself as his own true creator. To use idealistic dialectic for this materialistic purpose, Marx took the principle of correspondence, or as above, so below, and turned it upside down. As below, so above. Now it was not the absolute spirit that crafted historically perfected practical reality. Now it was a practical man traveling through the ages of history to create the absolute ideal man. This is a very important change because the upper dimension is now coded in language that doesn't seem so mystical, the realm of possibilities. But these are not real possibilities. They are just imaginary simulations that are furnished with shapes of the material world. But with no proof that they can be arranged in that way, they remain utopias. One aspect of this utopia is that now it is not supernatural but natural with erased parts that the author didn't like. Some aspects of reality are simply discarded as unreal and unnatural, like competition or hierarchy. For this reason, for Marx, the dialectical picture is painted with a strong emphasis on Rousseau's natural man and the Gnostic impulse of social prison. Marx's story looks like this. At the beginning of history, man lived in nature. Man worked personally with others in unity, crafting nature to his own needs and reflecting himself in it, humanizing it. And because he saw himself reflected in nature, he recognized himself as the creator. For Marx, work took on a mystical meaning because it was a way of dialectical transformation by synthesizing subjective vision and objective reality. At this stage, man was one with his needs. The result of work reflected him. The fall came with the invention of the division of labor, followed by private property, which excluded people from the effects of work and assigned it only to few. For him, capital is therefore not only personal. It is a social power that alienates you from own vision and its fruits. Now, the worker no longer reflected himself and his vision in nature, but someone else's. Man became alienated from his vision and true nature as the self-creator. With this division, a clash of visions and interests emerged, repeating the Hegelian master and slave dialectic. However, as before, the overall state of man's nature, or what was Geist for Hegel, meaning the overall state of the ideal, is not reflected in the single relation of two people. Man's nature is reflected by the overall state of the mode of production that society currently has. The whole history is a set of changes in those modes that condition and shape us to reflect a given stage. It is not spirit wandering through epochs, but society shaped by the mode of production. From natural communism to slavery, to feudalism, to capitalism, and then to socialism, and finally, communism, recompleting free man living for true species and collective nature. But now in a technologically advanced state. This environment crafted by the mode of production conditions us and produces ideas governing each epoch. But because the given epoch is impure, it includes domination and exploitation. The ideas, norms, and institutions reflect that state, meaning they rationalize and legitimize the current social order. The society is divided into the class that operates infrastructure and through work produces value and superstructure that lives off of it. The managerial class producing ideas and values of capitalists. Social norms are therefore like a prison artificially constructed, and they legitimize the division in classes prescribed by categories of property. All people are conditioned by the place they occupy in this web, but they also feel its effects. The feeling that negates the current status quo, the pain and anger on exploiters, produces the energy that pushes society towards historical change. Class consciousness is a realization that the people in one group are conditioned and exploited by the current mode of production. Class consciousness gives rise to the realization of the historical role for the oppressed that class conflict demands. Of course, true consciousness means seeing reality through dialectical frame, seeing reality through theory and sacrificing your own persona and ideas to the absolute truth of the theory. Here, the oppressed are called to challenge and change society. They are the negation to the thesis, current society. As the tensions rise, so will the consciousness, and finally it will burst in revolution. Here we hear concepts like quantity versus quality and the principle of polarity. After the revolution, those with elevated consciousness will take control and reform society. To do that, they will control the means of production of human nature, which for Marxists meant the means of material production. First, through force and the dictatorship of the proletariat, the oppressed will introduce new social relations that abolish artificial divisions like private property. When people become sufficiently conditioned by this new state and get used to it, the state will become superfluous and will wither away on its own, leaving us in a communist utopia where primitive communist order will be furnished with modern technology. In this world, man will have revealed his true ultimate essence, socialist man, a self-creator of humanized reality and species. The tensions and individual steps to that end can only be understood through an elevated plane that understands interconnectedness, movement, and the objective of the whole. Interpreting reality through the theory of dialectic, having correct consciousness means therefore interpreting society as a conflict of groups constantly nearing the purification of society. Those with consciousness, like Marx therefore, understand that the goal of man is to produce the ultimate man living in a socialist society. The way to get there is to put into practice the understanding provided by the theory, hence the term praxis. This rule was expressed in his famous dictum. The philosophers have hitherto only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. This is an important part because here we see in full glory that Marx is actually a social alchemist. Let's compare his claim to one. Scientific method seeks to understand things as they are, while alchemy seeks to bring about a desired state of affairs. To put it another way, the primary objective of science is truth, that of alchemy, operational success. Here again, at the end of the story, we understand the dialectical triad, which is the engine of history fueled by negation. In practical terms, it means class struggle, and in terms of ideas, it means criticism. For Marx, this criticism was a very important process, a sacred fire of purification. His program would involve ruthless criticism of all that exists. At the end, the Hegelian alchemical obver is translated in Marxism as sublation. We have now gone through the story painted by Hegel and Marx. Both are historical systems, both dialectical, one materialistic and the other idealistic, but both unmistakably alchemical. Because both claimed they discovered a true science of history, the simpler story we saw at the beginning was now systematized. We can therefore organize the story underlying Marxian dialectics into more specific terms. Marx, like Hegel, believed that dialectical laws govern reality. Existence is a continual movement in which a series of clashes purify society until it reaches its climax in a perfect form. Historical progress takes us from the state of nature, primitive communism, through slavery, feudalism, and capitalism to socialism, and eventually to communism. Communism is a return, recompilation, on a higher modernized plane, the state of collective naturalism. At any given stage, he saw society as divided and antagonized in dialectical conflict of groups. This hostile segregation is due to the category that privileges some and exploits others. For Marx, this category was capital and private property. It was this divide that ripped us out of the state of nature where we were at one with our instincts, objects of our work, and material possessions. He saw that the society built upon this divide provides rationalizations for the current state, crafting ideologies that present current inequality and oppression as just. Laws and customs are just interpretations that excuse the status quo. Above all, religion is the opium of the masses. Marx believed that the whole of society is structured by this divide, resembling the current mode of production and property relations. Each human is submerged, formed, and conditioned by it, essentially imprisoned in the present stage of society. However, he saw that man submerged in this state has a glimpse of the higher order because he feels. He suffers exploitation and experiences indignation and alienation from his true self, his own personal vision of himself because he does the work for others. That feeling of displacement from his own subjectivity is a call to realize it, call to negate the status quo. This subjectivity is a higher essence trapped in the present, imprisoning, lower form of society. Negative emotions will attack and drive to improve and purify it. For him, a dialectical picture of man is one of man who has a subjective vision and needs to externalize it in the material world. He does it by work, which transforms reality in his image, humanizing it. However, man is individually insufficient to transform the whole of nature into his image. He can only do that hand in hand with others. But how to do that with others without imposing on them individual vision and personal interests? The historical riddle, as Marx framed it, points to communism, where man works collectively with others to externalize the collective vision, the shared interest of the species, not the individual, predatory interest of the self. The riddle of man's historical essence is a dialectic between one's subjective vision and the objective world on the one hand, and on the other between individual and species being. The solution to this riddle is a collective worker. Now, if this man, alienated from himself, realizes the nature of his oppression, the nature of the conflict theory, the antagonism within society, if he sees the whole history as a series of dialectical tensions, if he sees the whole reality through this dialectical frame, he will gain true consciousness, true, higher understanding. He will now know where history leads and what is the historical purpose of the class he is in. A class of proletarians will eventually wake up and realize they are the vessel of historical necessity, that it is them who are the vessel of this higher consciousness, the shepherd of historical progress that is about to guide us into the next stage of history. As more and more workers wake up to this historical purpose, they will come to agitate and convert others. They will begin to negate, criticize, struggle, and attack the current order. Their objective will now be praxis, to put into practice the theory that animates their vision of history and their holy role in it. Eventually, the tensions will burst into a violent revolution. The revolution will put in the hands of proletarians the means of crafting and producing human nature, means of material production. Here proletarians will form a new dictatorship, which in its higher historical wisdom will condition, craft, mold, and transform human nature into a new one. They will create socialist man. As people will become increasingly conditioned by this new order, the state will need less and less to terrorize people to adopt a new way of life. Eventually, state will wither away, leaving us in a peaceful collective utopia, where man is again one with nature and his collective species nature, but now in an elevated, modernized, and industrialized society, or in the language of Rousseau, savage made to live in cities. Theories of Marx and Hegel, even though speculative and in no way proven, were seen as a practical science. Therefore, Marxism was commonly referred to as dialectical materialism or scientific socialism. Their systems were laundered as science by academia, even though they believe they see the ultimate picture of what things should become, the vernymph that is more true than mere sciences. Their ideas of producing the ultimate man or society were applied all over the world, often to colonial reality in German and French colonies. But not only there. For example, Prussia, which participated in the partitions of Poland at the end of the 18th century, found itself including in its nation Poles in the amount of 40% of the population. Prussians soon began the Kulturkampf, the cultural struggle to purify a nation. They sought to subsume the Poles, or as they called them, Aroks from the land of Vistula, into a higher spirit of the German nation. The ideas of Hegel's system promised to produce savages made to live in cities, and the dialectical struggle of two opposing nations promised inevitable success. Friedrich Engels saw Poles as a nation without a history, nation to be discarded by historical movement and thrown into the dustbin of history. Marx had a bit different take, advocating for the resurrection of Poland but only as a tool. He saw it as a vehicle for his theory. Poles who lost their country did so by clinging to their culture and refusing to adopt the most elevated form of society. But if they were to reform society as a proletarian state, they would gain the power to reconstruct themselves and bring the light of progress and revolution to the rest of Europe. However, this didn't happen. What is worse, it did not happen just in Poland, but anywhere. 60 years passed since the publishing of the Communist Manifesto. The world was changing, moving, but not progressing according to the dialectical story. In the new age, what could the believers do in the face of failure? For social alchemists, the age of twisting and retelling their story came. In the words of Georg Lukács, let us assume for the sake of argument that recent research had disproved once and for all every one of Marx's individual visas. Even if this were to be proved, every serious orthodox Marxist would still be able to accept all such modern findings without reservation, and hence dismiss all of Marx's theses in toto, without having to renounce his orthodoxy for a single moment. Orthodox Marxism, therefore, does not imply the uncritical acceptance of the results of Marx's investigations. It is not the belief in this or that thesis, nor the exegesis of a sacred book. On the contrary, orthodoxy refers exclusively to method. Here we can see a couple of tricks that fool us to this day. Alchemists are never wrong. They may be mistaken, but only about the lower representation of reality, but even then, they still are correct about a higher perception of the ultimate. They still hold in their hands the ladder tied to God's ankle. They only can't find a way to climb it. It is just a matter of correct praxis. We all have heard the line, that was not a real socialism. It means that dialecticians are always in two camps. One theoretical, where they, as some say, hold noble and admirable ideals but have no power, and the other where they gain power, but the resulting massacre means they didn't apply the correct practice. Failure never discards the true vision. For those who possess true sight, gnosis, true consciousness, the holistic picture, Vernunft, see the divine plan, the picture at the end of history. For them, the question is always only about finding the correct rationalization for the tactics necessary to gain power and transform society. To make this sneaky move acceptable in the highland of academia, the magic of dialectic begins to criticize their own method. But we now know that this is a trick. Dialectical negation, the criticism serves only to purify and readapt the theory from the current stage to the next. Or put another way by Theodor Adorno, what remained theoretically inadequate in Hegel and Marx became part of historical praxis. That is why it is to be theoretically reflected upon anew, instead of the thought bowing irrationally to the primacy of praxis. What happened to Marxists resembles the origins of the Seventh-day Adventists. The day of great disappointment marks a specific day when believers have expected Jesus' second advent. But when he didn't come, most lost faith. Others held to the prophecy, but reframed its meaning in a new way that was acceptable enough to be swallowed again, hence the still existing church. For dialecticians, the great disappointment came in many forms around the end of the World War I. In Italy, a prominent communist by the name of Benito Mussolini tried to figure out why the stress of war, waged in the interest of the bourgeoisie and at the cost of proletarians, didn't produce a revolution. Instead, it rallied people together around nationhood, despite class divides. His conclusion was to readapt his Marxist beliefs into a more idealistic Hegelian story. He concluded that the highest form and vessel of true consciousness is not a class consciousness, but the spirit of the nation. Here it was this mystical spirit marching through epochs and waging a secret war of purification. He formed fascism, which in turn produced even more mystical National Socialism or Nazism in Germany. In Russia, the Marxists, however, remained materialistic. Vladimir Lenin held to the Marxian story, which described the rising tensions that would produce class consciousness powerful enough to boil a nation and cause a revolution. His upgrade to the theory was to say that consciousness will not succeed spontaneously, but needs direction. For Lenin, a vanguard or a party would be the vessel of the highest form of consciousness. Party and the vanguard would become a priest shepherding the proletariat into the new age. And funnily enough, as in my metaphor, the party was organized with a zeal of a religious order, and it gave him the absolute power over the members. This finally worked, and the social fabric gave way to revolution, beginning a period of proletarian dictatorship promised by Marx. At the same time in Hungary, the revolution succeeded, but here the regime of Bela Khan held only for a short time and then collapsed. These three developments produced a series of problems for Marxists in the rest of Western countries. First, anger at fascists that beat them at their own game. They will hate each other with unique fury because they know they are playing the same game and they have their eyes fixed on the same prize. We know from history that the currents of one religion hate each other even more than they hate outsiders like Sunnis and Shiites in Islam or Protestants and Catholics during the 17th century in Europe, or even football clubs from the same city. The second consequence was bewilderment at the Russian Revolution. It was supposed to happen according to the dialectical progress of history, as the next step of the progress in the most developed capitalist nation like England or France, not in Russia, still lingering in the feudal epoch. And thirdly, why didn't the revolution hold or happen at all in the West where capitalism was booming? The answer that emerged falls somewhere in the middle between idealistic fascism and materialist classic communism. A new generation of theorists like Georg Lukács and Antonio Gramsci concluded that the prison, the lower dimension we are trapped in, is constructed not only by modes of production, but also by the larger culture. They proposed that the culture of Western Europe acted as the immune system repelling the adoption of revolutionary consciousness. To make communism take hold, they first needed to infiltrate, find an Archimedean point, and break the culture. In the words of Antonio Gramsci, socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm Christianity. In the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture via infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media by transforming the consciousness of society. Georg Lukács, previously the Minister of Education in the Bela Khan's revolutionary Hungarian regime, was helping to realize this vision by giving a hand in forming an Institute for Social Research in Germany, later known as the Frankfurt School. Here, a new systematic way of promoting Marxism was developed which focused on sociology, psychology, and culture. Max Horkheimer wrote a famous essay titled Traditional and Critical Theory. Critical, of course, meant dialectical, but the method was now directed toward less materialistic questions. The theory still proclaimed to be the savior and prophet of humankind, but it was now framed differently. It was more technical. Now theory required three criteria. It must be explanatory, practical, and normative, all at the same time. That is, it must explain what is wrong with the current social reality, identify the actors to change it, and provide both clear norms for criticism and achievable practical goals for social transformation. That was a method of, if you wish, incremental revolution. That was a theory much better suited to academic infiltration because it masked so much better as real scholarship. We still see them trying to capture the God of history by writing. Hegel's program, to see the absolute, the goal of his philosophy, as a result, remains valid for Marxism with its very different objects of knowledge, and is even of greater concern to it, as the dialectical process is seen to be identical with the course of history. We can still see the claims about the progress of history as well as the stratification. They still talk about the utopia and still pretend it is not a magical dimension, yet they still struggle against society and nature. Dialectical materialism understands freedom as historical, empirical transcendence, as a force of social change, transcending its immediate form also in a socialist society, not toward ever more production, not toward heaven or paradise, but toward an ever more peaceful, joyful struggle with the inexorable resistance of society and nature. This is the philosophical core of the theory of the permanent revolution. We still hear that they uphold beliefs of interconnectedness and movement that reforms all those dimensions. Dialectical logic holds that every particular content is formed by the universal principle that determines the movement of the whole. They still believe society is best understood by conflict, that the reason for this conflict is the divide that is represented by capital that privileges one class over the other. They still hold that the ideology legitimizes this state, and the construction of society reflects that fact. The meaning of emotionality, The pathos is still maintained, the negative one announces injustice, and the positive one is not only pleasurable, but the call for something we are entitled to. The picture of man, dialectical man, is still that of a creator that in collective work should reflect himself in reality. The biggest change, of course, regards the point about the social prison, the lower dimension of the upcoming utopia. Now Frankfurt School goes deep to the problem of false consciousness, meaning a state in which current ideologies fool and manipulate people. All liberation depends on the consciousness of servitude, and the emergence of this consciousness is always hampered by the predominance of needs and satisfactions, which, to a great extent, have become the individual's own. Here we begin to see that their opposition takes really seriously Rousseauian impulse at the core of intellectual leftism. They really lean into the disgust and hostility toward their own culture. We hear them say things like, modernity is equated with a deformed world, while Rousseau, the initiator of retrospective hostility towards one's own time, set a light on the last of the great styles. What spurred his revulsion was too much form, the denaturalization of society, and one must have tradition in oneself to hate it properly. They begin to reveal they are this very weird kind of conservatives that long for an imaginary state of the past that never was, but nevertheless they are entitled to it. And at the same time, on behalf of this fantasy, they are unashamed to hate every real development as inadequate. We hear them turn to alchemy even stronger than previous movements because it promises to channel this hate, this disgust into a purifying force and call it a virtue. We read, Hegel's dialectic is permeated with the profound conviction that all immediate forms of existence in nature and history are bad because they do not permit things to be what they can be. True existence begins only when the immediate state is recognized as negative, when beings become subjects and strive to adapt their outward state to their potentialities. The dialectical pattern represents, and is thus the truth of, a world permeated by negativity, a world in which everything is something other than it really is, and in which opposition and contradiction constitute the laws of progress. They still believe that only a revealed insight can guide us to the promised land. This consciousness is to be shepherded by a prophet, now in the person of the intellectual himself, and they still believe in praxis as a tactic of forcing their theory upon reality. But faced with numerous failures, they now know they are calling for something cruel. However, they have a higher knowledge. They know who to sacrifice on the altar of progress. We read passages as follows. The proposition, the end justifies the means, is indeed, as a general statement, intolerable, but so is, as a general statement, its negation. In radical political practice, the end belongs to a world different from and contrary to the established universe of discourse and behavior. But the means belong to the latter and are judged by the latter on its own terms, the very terms which the end invalidates. The end now does justify the means. Actions cease to be crimes if they serve to preserve and extend the free world. Conversely, what the enemy does is evil. What he says, propaganda. We see that the story is recreated in full and is masquerading as an academic theory, when in fact is a political plot to subvert society. The abolition of social relationships which presently hinder development is in fact the next historical goal. For critical theorists, the emphasis placed on the triad is somewhat different. They still absolutely revere the negation, the criticism, and the flame of the god of progress. But they less focus on the sublated, elevated part, even though they know the ultimate society will be beautiful. The subsequent stages and the precise shape of the future they don't describe as much. They pull the trick on us, claiming that future perfection cannot be described in the words of the impure society. What kind of life? We are still confronted with the demand to state the concrete alternative. The demand is meaningless if it asks for a blueprint of the specific institutions and relationships, which would be those of the new society. They cannot be determined a priori. They will develop in trial and error as the new society develops. I trust you hear again all those alchemical influences posing as science. Although the work of cultural Marxists and the Frankfurt School was very popular, it didn't have enough time to produce results, especially because their also evil twin, fascism, was already taking over and ensuring that its main contender for the same market wouldn't succeed. In Italy, Gramsci was put into prison and died there. Frankfurt school members had to flee from Germany because most of them were Jewish. Despite amassing great power in the 1930s, World War II dealt an enormous blow to fascism. However, bad news soon came for materialist alchemists as well. After the end of World War II in 1953, Stalin died. For years, many influential intellectuals were saying that he was demonized by stupid, uneducated people who didn't see the beauty of the theory. But then came Khrushchev, who in 1956 publicly confessed to the crimes Soviets were perpetuating in Stalin's name. Now, those intellectuals lost their moral superiority. This news had the greatest impact on French intellectuals. The latest shameful revelation that Soviet cruelty wasn't a purifying fire that elevates society but just plain old cruelty led them to question if dialectic even works. Because if it doesn't, then they have no way of purifying anything, no way of gazing upon the end of history, nor holistically understanding the purpose of each cog in the moving machinery of history. French were left in the prison of a tyrannical social order. The sun of truth they were looking toward through the only window in the ceiling of oppression turned out to be another lie, just an artificial light bulb. So what do you do when all is a lie, all is manipulation and exploitation, and the only thing that was supposed to remove the veil of lies disappears? You lose hope. Therefore, they lost the belief in revelation, and they lost a vehicle that could transport them to its realization. They concluded that not only is there no true method, but there is no way of accessing truth at all. However, even though they claimed to lose faith in meta-narratives and lamented the death of meaning, they referred mostly to dialectic because as Marxists, they already didn't respect any other beliefs. And also, as we will see, that claim was a lie. They still believed in the story underlying the dialectical worldview. They just lost the method of laundering it as science. They needed to readapt it. During that era in France, structuralism was a very fashionable theory, a linguistic model asserting that all meanings and perceptions are framed by language, which forms a web of interdependencies. Many French intellectuals, who were also communists, specialized in this field and intertwined it with dialectical historicism. For them, structuralism proved to be a useful tool for interpreting ideologies that rationalize the alienation of man for the purpose of exploitation. For materialists, that web of social constructions had a rigid form because they were fixed against an ultimate one historical end. Ideologies, although lies, were just imperfect, unhumanized forms of historical progress. However, now the only stable point of reference, the ultimate truth, was nowhere on the horizon. For them, the web and its organizational principle became detached, fluid. Post-structuralists, therefore, looked at society as imprisoned, but not in a rigid scheme, but in the web of meanings, a field that changes fluently with movements of the underlying source. They became obsessed with this source, the organizing principle that constructs and shapes transformations of narratives that control us, power. Even though the postmodern movement is most fluid and least coherent, and individual thinkers differed significantly, their thoughts still held similarities. They still harbored a sense that we are removed from the true real dimension. They still believe that we are trapped. They believe that narratives create fake realities, prisons that oppress us. They believe that those narratives create salient simulacra or hyperrealities that we fall into instead of reality. Just like previous generations, they held this peculiar conservatism that feels the longing for the honesty of the fictional, unreachable past, while believing that society is what cheated us out of it. So, again, while for dialecticians, the method expresses the truth about reality, for postmodernists, there is no access to the truth of reality. Therefore, their method switched to social reality, reality detached from the natural order, but still the only dimension we have access to. Their method still described everything. It is just that everything that can be explained doesn't regard natural reality. In a very thinly veiled trick, their focus remained a method of linguistic acrobatics, but shifted from dialectic to discourses. Because the discursive method couldn't look into the future of history, the absolute was lost. But they still believed in historical causality, so their methods focused on genealogies and archaeologies. If they can't see the judgment day, they can at least see the fall, the moment where power produced through discourses lies in exploitations. They would therefore search for tactical moves and narratives that would reveal such developments. They would still see society as divided, but not by the capital, but by the property of language they called othering. The fall with the division occurs in meanings assigned to inherently connected terms but with opposite connotation. They claimed you can't understand man without understanding woman, heterosexual from homosexual, sane from crazy, and to one of those power have assigned negative connotation. We see that the power to ascribe meaning takes place of the same thing as did capital in Marxian theory, and the most important and privileging meaning is about who gets to decide what is considered true. The society, therefore, is submerged in a discursive field where each claim about meaning, truth, and knowledge is an application of power. A narrative field is organized by power and, although constructed differently, does similar things to Marxist ideologies. They create simulations that remove us from reality and feed salient pictures designed to manipulate us. The society is organized on the tracks prescribed by those narratives. Institutions formalize this structure, and we, the society and individual people, are still molded and constructed by it. Man is therefore still trapped. But even though postmodernists didn't know what man is supposed to be, they did know he needs to be freed. They therefore advanced the idea of freeing subjectivities. Man was still truly himself when he externalized his subjectivity. For postmodernists, while already mentioned inclinations cannot be still framed by true revealed knowledge and true consciousness, that didn't mean that people don't have false consciousness that was an artificial simulacrum of lies. Intellectuals still had a great role to play in pointing toward weak spots of the system that is to be crashed. Here in Foucault, we hear this Gnostic impulse that I was speaking of earlier. The moral goal of purification now didn't have a way up, so the purification is replaced by the solvent. Postmodernists, therefore, use deconstruction as a way to press society until it breaks and releases what was subjugated. Here we can see that even though they would swore they were not Marxists, the plan was to rescue as much Marx as possible. I believe it is the nature of deconstruction that lack of elevation, the obver, will cause the emphasis in the future decades to be more and more on justice, not on freedom. Because if you don't know what you will achieve by breaking something, but you know it deserves it, justice is a more fitting rationalization of your hostility. And praxis was not to be a tactic of achieving anything, but just an attitude of witnessing the downfall. Therefore, it is a practice of playing games and performances that mock and humiliate the system. Postmodernists outsourced the shame of mistakes onto the old dialectical theory that they discarded. They now had clean slate and new methods to play with. Even though they became ultimate cynics, they didn't lose their zeal to political applications of the theory. They attacked every norm and standard of society as worthy of deconstruction. They participated in riots of the '60s and protested at Sorbonne. Most postmodernists advocated for sex with kids as expressed in the famous letter that argued that the current age of consent, 14 years old, was intolerably high. The most famous of them, Foucault, allegedly was implicated in pedophilia. As a true postmodernist, he disbelieved even facts that were closest to him, as he denied the existence of HIV that was killing him. Now with newfound moral superiority, postmodernists could attack the communists too. To his credit, Foucault helped the opposition in the Soviet bloc, but more importantly for us, postmodernists wrote specifically about Marxists. As they were now not responsible for dialectical theory, they confessed all the things that socialists were denying. They admitted the religious architecture and the narcissistic messianic impulses in statements like these. Now, if there is a spirit of Marxism which I will never be ready to renounce, it is not only the critical idea or the questioning stance. It is even more a certain emancipatory and messianic affirmation, a certain experience of the promise that one can try to liberate from any dogmatics and even from any metaphysico-religious determination, from any messianism. Postmodernism became a powerhouse of a theory. It influenced an enormous range of disciplines that undertook deconstructive language games. However, if you have nothing to replace what you are toppling, you are doomed to dry out. And so it did. We may be tempted to think now that the whole project died. Unfortunately, no, because it never was about the truth, the theory. It was about finding a correct theoretical rationalization for practice and underlying motivation, a correct explanation to put hands on power. But now begins the age of the Swiss buffet. Having produced many variations and types of tools to promote underlying motivation, the game was to combine into a tool capable of finally breaking society. Usually after succeeding, the theory didn't need to be adapted further, nor did it hurt that it was combined with seemingly unfitting parts. For example, combining postmodern narratives and vision of upcoming utopias. This is an important point because in their alchemic reality, truth is not what corresponds to reality, more is logical in the same way as we think it should be. Truth is a tactic that succeeds in getting power. That is why, once Lenin added the element of the vanguard to the Marxist model and the revolution succeeded, Russians didn't need to develop the cultural struggle. But the Chinese did. In the late 1940s, due to a long communist guerrilla warfare known as the Long March, Mao gained power. He initially implemented a classical Marxist-Leninist model and advocated for the Great Leap Forward. He aimed to transform Chinese feudal society into a modern power. To do that, he confiscated farming appliances from farmers and built crooked furnaces, which were meant to serve as the foundation for the industrialized new society. However, the nation did not experience improvement. Having no tools to grow food, countless millions of people starved. The party eventually removed Mao from power. It is unclear whether Mao obtained Gramsci's work, the prison notebooks smuggled out of an Italian prison, or if he employed similar criticism to reach comparable conclusions. Nevertheless, in academia, it is said that Mao did what Gramsci thought. Thus, he accused culture of hindering liberation, which justified his return to power and launched the Cultural Revolution. Mao waged war against the four olds: old customs, old habits, old culture, and old ideas. He divided the nation into 10 identities, with 5 considered black and bad, and 5 regarded as red and good. Based on that, every person could participate in the nationwide hunt for oppressors. He established a Red Guard to promote the red categories, and millions of people were subsequently slaughtered. After he firmly established his power, he sent the Red Guard to work on farms, and he did not see the need for any more changes. Many other leaders adopted tactics to their local climate, devising their own blend of theory, drawing from a diverse range of Hegelian, Marxist, cultural, and postmodern philosophies. One after another, countries began to crack, as we know from the histories of Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, Pol Pot in Cambodia, Vietnam, North Korea, and many more African nations. The hardest mental gymnastics needed to be done where culture resisted the most, as it did in the West. We go now to the USA, where we find the same socialists that in Germany tried to turn academia into a political warfare. Most important members of Frankfurt School came here, and what they didn't have time to finish in Europe before the Second World War, they were now doing in American universities. But here they needed to readapt it a little bit to new culture. The first problem they had to deal with was not just that the culture was repelling their theories, but that capitalism was succeeding. Herbert Marcuse, who became the father of the New Left, lamented the state of modern man in which people were one-dimensional. People had better lives, and God forbid, they were content with it. But this happy life in liberal capitalism was only empty and shallow dimension of true life. The success of the West was cynically framed as capitalism stealing the revolutionary potential of the middle class. To their horror, the proletarians ceased to be the grave diggers of capitalism and were content to live in this lower, impure dimension. To the disappointment of the Frankfurt School, the culture was not collapsing, but perpetuating itself, and hence they focused on the problem of its reproduction. The task became finding a new anger, a new fury that would serve as the Archimedean point from which they can topple society. Their answer was to point toward the intelligentsia and ghetto populations, announcing the age of identity politics. What is of great significance is that they knew they are deviating from the doctrine, but they believed that practice necessitated it. This is an important point because many arguments gaslight us today, claiming that Marxism is economic philosophy focused on class divides and it has nothing to do with identity politics. Here's the precise moment where leading Marxist intellectuals call for this very change. For Marxian theory, the location, or rather contraction, of the opposition in certain middle-class strata and in the ghetto population appears as an intolerable deviation, as does the emphasis on biological and aesthetic needs, regression to bourgeois, or even worse, aristocratic ideologies. But in the advanced monopoly capitalist countries, the displacement of the opposition from the organized industrial working classes to militant minorities is caused by the internal development of the society, and the theoretical deviation only reflects this development. In a society that successfully improves the lives of the people, Marx posited the plan of the Great Refusal. If there is no fire, you need to make one. The plan was to destroy people's very ability to function. If the system doesn't make people its enemies, you have to destabilize them so that they will become unable to live in it. Then they will grow to hate it and become its enemies. Then they can be used to rip it apart. Marx, therefore, wrote things like this: "The development of a radical political consciousness among the masses is conceivable only if and when the economic stability and the social cohesion of the system begin to weaken." It was the traditional role of the Marxist-Leninist Party to prepare the ground for this development. It follows that the radical change, which is to transform the existing society into a free society, must reach into a dimension of the human existence hardly considered in Marxian theory, the biological dimension in which the vital, imperative needs and satisfactions of man assert themselves. Inasmuch as these needs and satisfactions reproduce a life in servitude, liberation presupposes changes in this biological dimension, that is to say, different instinctual needs, different reactions of the body as well as the mind. The result would be a spread not only of discontent and mental sickness, but also of inefficiency, resistance to work, refusal to perform, negligence, indifference, factors of dysfunction which would hit a highly centralized and coordinated apparatus, where breakdown at one point may easily affect large sections of the whole. This entire sphere and atmosphere, with all its power, is invalidated. Nothing that any of these politicians, representatives, or candidates declares is of any relevance to the rebels. They cannot take it seriously, although they know very well that it may mean to them getting beaten, going to jail, losing a job. They are not professional martyrs. They prefer not to be beaten, not to go to jail, not to lose their job. But for them, this is not a question of choice. The protest and refusal are parts of their metabolism, and they extend to the power structure as a whole. No matter how remote from these notions the rebellion may be, no matter how destructive and self-destructive it may appear, no matter how great the distance between the middle-class revolt in the metropoles and the life and death struggle of the wretched of the earth, common to them is the depth of the refusal. Herbert's ideas about revolution, sexuality, and violence were extremely influential and played a significant role in the protests of the 1960s. Fortunately, the energy released in them did not have enough power to break society, not least because liberal norms were actually addressing and rectifying injustices. As the violence died down, the radicals were once again disappointed. What they came up with was to adapt the methods that had already been proven in the Cultural Revolution in China. Rudi Dutschke coined the slogan "Long March Through Institutions" as an echo of the Maoist Long March. If violence didn't work, and if the culture didn't swallow true consciousness, the left needed to subvert institutions. Starting from the 1960s, radical theories would no longer be confined to specific academic departments. Critical and postmodern methods would increasingly spread beyond their own domains and infiltrate other disciplines. We read in the words of Isaac Gottsman, to the question, where did all the 60s radicals go? The most accurate answer would be neither to religious cults nor yuppium, but to the classroom. After the fall of the New Left arose a new left, an academic left. For many of these young scholars, Marxist thought, and particularly what some refer to as Western Marxism or neo-Marxism, and what I will refer to as the critical Marxist tradition, was an intellectual anchor. as participants in the radical politics of the 60s entered graduate school and moved into faculty positions and started publishing, the critical turn began to change scholarship throughout the humanities and social sciences. The field of education was no exception. The game was now easy to play. Radicals only had to choose the domain, find a category, and accuse it of being exclusive, as all categories by definition are. Now you would build a story around it to fit its environment. You would argue that this divide is segregating whole society into conflicting groups, classes, and identities. You then dramatize its effect and tell a story of systemic consequences: oppression, exploitation, discrimination, supremacy, hate, phobia, and marginalization. The marginalized are trapped by ideologies, discourses, and narratives that are legitimatized by institutions. The experience of this oppression gives the exploited group a special knowledge about the problems of the system, and if they frame this knowledge through correct theory, it will become true consciousness. This theory, which of course is in the hands of intellectuals, will tell people to form a movement and exactly which category and which parts of the system need to be destroyed. The movement, therefore, needs only to obey and find a correct practice to gain influence and start transforming the system, diversifying, redistributing, including, and so on. In essence, society needs to be recentered on movement interests. We will go through the biggest current representing those developments: race, education, sex, and sexuality. I want to show you that despite many moods we have talked about earlier, an almost identical structure to that mentioned in Marx and Hegel is being recreated. Most of those currents use postmodern discursive methods as an epistemological fundament, but frame the society, humanity, and moral direction using critical theory. I will spare us from those most technical aspects about the underlying method, but show you that the rest of the dialectical worldview is still represented in those movements. The lower dimensions and social prison created by divisive ideologies and framed in the system. The pathos and consciousness give ultimate knowledge of direction and movement, and the criticism and praxis that purify and elevate us toward utopia. In America, the easiest wound to infect was, of course, race relations, through people like Herbert's Marcuse student Angela Davis and building on the work done by W.E.B. Du Bois and Derek Bell. The critical race theory was formed. Now the artificial and illegitimate category was race. In her landmark paper, Whiteness as Property, Cheryl Harris places race in the same place as Marxists did bourgeois private property. She states that whiteness and property share a common premise, a conceptual nucleus of a right to exclude. This conceptual nucleus has proven to be a powerful center around which whiteness as property has taken shape. That supposition creates many other claims, like the famous white privilege, that reinforces the same point. This claim, of course, divides society into warring groups. The fact is, all ethnic groups, once they fall under the gaze and power of race makers, become racialized. The racializing serves the core mandate of race, to create hierarchies of value. That hierarchy in society is framed and justified by ideologies and narratives. Whiteness, racism, liberalism, meritocracy, colorblindness, or individualism. Theorists claim that, by socially constructed, we mean that all knowledge understood by humans is framed by the ideologies, language, beliefs, and customs of human societies. Even the field of science is subjective. All the dominant ideologies in society support willful ignorance. The ideologies of meritocracy, equal opportunity, individualism, and human nature we described above play a powerful role in denying the current of privilege and insisting that society is just. For theorists, all people are immersed, socialized, and conditioned into this oppressive social prison, the vast, ever-present system of exploitation. Our socialization is the foundation of our identity. To consider that we have been socialized to participate in systems of oppression that we don't condone is to challenge our very sense of who we are. But this socialization is not something we could choose or avoid and doesn't make us bad people. It does, however, make us responsible for re-educating ourselves and working to change oppressive systems. Here again, the light of revelation comes from the experience of oppression, the experience of suffocated humanity, which means that the world doesn't reflect your subjectivity. They write things like this: "We know injustice when we feel it." From a critical social justice framework, informed knowledge does not refer exclusively to academic scholarship, but also includes the lived experiences and perspectives that marginalized groups bring to bear on an issue, due to their insider standing. However, scholarship can provide useful language with which marginalized groups can frame their experiences within the broader society. Dominant groups have the most narrow or limited view of society because they do not have to understand the experiences of the minoritized group in order to survive. Because they control the institutions, they have the means to legitimize their view. Minoritized groups often have the widest view of society in that they must understand both their own and the dominant group's perspective, develop a double consciousness to succeed. And if only it will be framed and directed by correct theory, the true consciousness can be born. With such consciousness comes understanding about the need to form a movement and evangelizing or rising consciousness in others. Then follows the moral work of ruthless criticism and praxis like anti-racism, diversity, etc. The healing here again means attacking what is deemed sinful. You now wouldn't be surprised to hear that anti-racism requires discrimination and prejudice, but is directed against the impure parts of the systems, meaning those who are responsible for its existence. For example, proponents of affirmative action justify requiring the sons to pay for the sins of the fathers by pointing to the compelling interest in eliminating the disadvantage of the present built on the oppression of the past. From the guru of anti-racism, Ibram Kendi, we read, "The only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination." The whole system needs to be remade, as we hear in the famous line, "Master's tool won't dismantle a master's house, but can temporarily beat him at his game." Only at the end peace will come with the abolishment of division. Just like Marxism abolishes private property, here we will abolish whiteness and racial categories. Terminating racial categories is potentially the last, not the first, step in the anti-racist struggle. The echoes of Marx are striking. Just as Marx said, in this sense, the theory of the communists may be summed up in the single sentence: abolition of private property. Critical race theorists write things like these: critical whiteness studies become a framework to deconstruct the material, physical, emotional, and political power of whiteness. As we can see, the story is strikingly similar. We have a fallen system that alienates us from our true selves by instituting false arbitrary categories. They form a social prison with the use of ideologies that condition all of us. The knowledge about the direction of the movement toward progress is granted to those with special knowledge and consciousness, stemming from oppression. They are called upon to criticize, deconstruct the evil categories, and recreate the emancipated justice that awaits on the end of progress. This story took the place of civil rights movements when they achieved their objectives and packed up. The theory that today animates movements like BLM, George Floyd protests, or riots in France, and migration debates in Europe is not liberal. It is critical race theory, sometimes blended with post-colonial theory, that has grown from Hegel's and Marx's alchemical delusions and is openly anti-liberal, anti-Enlightenment, and anti-democratic. Now we turn to education. After the 60s, as you may recall, the radicals had on their hands the problem of the working class failing them because they didn't destroy the system. The issue at hand was the reproduction of the system. In living system, if culture is going to survive and last into the future, new generations of people need to be introduced to it and function in it, so they need to learn its norms and skills. This is what they attacked. In effect, critical pedagogy has sharply etched the political dimensions of schooling, arguing that schools operate mainly to reproduce the discourses, values, and privileges of existing elites. Society therefore needed to be broken at the level of educating. And although there were examples of turning education into politics in already existing totalitarian states, an attempt to do so in the West, for example in the work of John Dewey, the real success came when the work of Paulo Freire, a Brazilian Marxist, was discovered in North America by Henry Giroux. Freire found a way to hammer education into a Marxian frame. He was even so radical that he didn't switch to postmodern discourses but remained with dialectical frame. He said that, for dialogue to be a method of true knowledge, the knowing subjects must approach reality scientifically in order to seek the dialectical connections that explain the form of reality. Thus, to know is not to remember something previously known and now forgotten. Nor can doxa be overcome by logos apart from the dialectical relationship of man with his world, apart from men's reflective action upon the world. The essence of the education was for Freire the dialogical process of unveiling reality, which of course meant a dialectical process that will revolutionize society and inspire real revolution from the realm of schooling. For all the above reasons, I interpret the revolutionary process as dialogical cultural action, which is prolonged in cultural revolution once power is taken. In both stages, a serious and profound effort at conscientization, by means of which the people, through a true praxis, leave behind the status of objects to assume the status of historical subjects, is necessary. Just like critical race theorists turned whiteness into property, a status category, Freire turned the very fact of being educated into an arbitrary, privileging construct. To him, it became a badge of status that would license somebody to become part of the privileged class in society. Acquiring this badge would be only possible through adopting the imposed definitions as knowledge. Education in cultural action for domination is reduced to a situation in which the educator as the one who knows transfers existing knowledge to the learner as the one who does not know. In the banking concept of education, knowledge is a gift bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable upon those whom they consider to know nothing. Projecting absolute ignorance onto others, a characteristic of the ideology of oppression, negates education and knowledge as processes of inquiry. The teacher presents himself to his students as their necessary opposite. By considering their ignorance absolute, he justifies his own existence. The students, alienated like the slave in the Hegelian Dialectic, accept their ignorance as justifying the teacher's existence. But unlike the slave, they never discover that they educate the teacher. As you can hear, the man is alienated because the knowledge he learns is not created by him and does not reflect his ideas. He is taught to adjust to something external to him. And because those mystics don't believe that our society knows anything valuable about reality. Information and skills are not about truth, but about swallowing rules supporting the system of domination. That is why, for them, true education is about political struggle and knowledge about how to break society and escape it. Every student worthy of the name knows very well that the so-called neutrality of science from which flows, the equally famous impartiality of the scientist with his criminal indifference to the destiny of his discoveries, is nothing more than a necessary myth of the ruling classes. That is why he must not confuse a concern with truth, which characterizes all serious scientific effort, with the myth of this neutrality. If we don't transcend the idea of education as pure transference of a knowledge that merely describes reality, we will prevent critical consciousness from emerging and thus reinforce political illiteracy. There are no neutral educators. What we educators need to know is the type of political philosophy we subscribe to and for whose interests we work. As long as we are in the current society, we are trapped in social prison that builds up ideologies that support its structure. In this reality, culture and society creates ideologies that trap us in a society constructed on domination. This structure conditions us and alienates us from what we are supposed to become. We hear it in the following passages. Culture, in Paulo Freire's view, hides the ideologies that legitimate and distribute specific forms of culture as if they were unrelated to ruling class interests and existing configurations of power. Critical pedagogy has revealed how student identities are differentially constructed through social relations of schooling that promote and sustain asymmetrical relations of power and privilege. And our experiences are always constrained by conditions of possibility, systems of power that give significance to particular experiences. Here again, the pathos, emotionality, and subjectivity give us a glimpse of real truth. Paulo states, I insist on the affective domain of things, the humanistic and intuitive dimensions of the act of knowing. I never put feelings and emotions between parentheses, Man here is again only himself when he recreates reality in his own image. Whereas animals adapt themselves to the world to survive, men modify the world in order to be more. Again, true consciousness frames those feelings and seemingly contradictory forms of our reality and reveal their hidden nature behind the holistic movement. They now see that reality, a process and not a static fact, is full of contradictions, and that social conflicts are not metaphysical categories, but rather historical expressions of the confrontation of these contradictions. Any attempt, therefore, to solve conflict without touching the contradictions that have generated it only stifles the conflict and at the same time strengthens the ruling class. The prophetic position demands a critical analysis of the social structures in which the conflict takes place. Now all should be directed by the prophet, the vessel of consciousness which for Frere is educator, who doesn't impose his vision but leads others to it. The struggle begins with men's recognition that they have been destroyed. Propaganda, management, manipulation, all arms of domination, cannot be the instruments of their rehumanization. The only effective instrument is a humanizing pedagogy in which the revolutionary leadership establishes a permanent relationship of dialogue with the oppressed. The educator's role is to propose problems about the codified existential situations in order to help the learners arrive at a more and more critical view of their reality. This reclamation requires that the revolutionary leaders, progressing from what was previously dialogical cultural action, initiate the cultural revolution. At this point, revolutionary power moves beyond its role as a necessary obstacle confronting those who wish to negate humanity and assumes a new and bolder position, with a clear invitation to all who wish to participate in the reconstruction of society. In this sense, cultural revolution is a necessary continuation of the dialogical cultural action which must be carried out before the revolution reaches power. And again, the moral conviction that arises from this mystic and alchemical belief is a drive for evangelizing and purifying society. In education, dialectical model is framed by Frere as dialogics, which through so-called generative themes, generates simulated stories about familiar aspects of society and invites students to constantly search in them for hidden oppression. Here criticism is packaged as problematization, proving something is problematic because it is part of the system that was judged evil. It therefore needs to be incinerated and purified into a new term that presupposes the transformation of the world according to their vision. This process of criticism will go on ad infinitum until the eschaton immanentizes. For critical pedagogy, the goal of putting the theory into practice is still valid. It will require actual subversion of education, turning it into a political weapon and stoking in students anger and disgust against their own society. For them, not the skills will be considered true education, but ever new stages of consciousness that see evil and oppression and push them toward activism. True competence is attacking and ripping down society so the new utopia may arise like a phoenix from its ashes. Let's bear through a couple of quotes because they are just too good to pass. Fundamental to the principles that inform critical pedagogy is the conviction that schooling for self and social empowerment is ethically prior to questions of epistemology or to a mastery of technical or social skills that are primarily tied to the logic of the marketplace. Pedagogy for liberation works outside the inviolable boundaries of order in the rift between a subversive praxis and a concrete utopia. Critical pedagogy is more than a desacralization of the grand narratives of modernity, but seeks to establish new moral and political frontiers of emancipatory and collective struggle, where both subjugated narratives and new narratives can be written and voiced in the arena of democracy. Dare we conspire to create a critical pedagogy that is able to provide conditions for students to reject what they experience as a given, a pedagogy that includes a sharpened focus on the relationship among economies of capital investment, political economies, moral economies, economies of free expression, sexual economies, economies of belief and identity formation, and the construction of desire and formation of human will. A pedagogy of discontent and of outrage that is able to contest the hegemony of prevailing definitions of the everyday as the way things are. We also need to construct new narratives, new border narratives, in order to re-author the discourses of oppression in politically subversive ways, as well as create sites of possibility and enablement. We need to infuse critical pedagogy with a subversive power that is able to effect new cultural transgressions, and that cannot be brought within the fateful orbit of commodity exchange. Just as a side note, it is also worth reiterating at this point that it is a religion that requires actual conversions and moral rebuilding of the world according to divine subjective vision. That is why the work of Paulo Freire was also instrumental in forming the parasite designed to subvert religion, liberation theology. This parasite latched onto theology and was exceptionally potent in South America. It can be illustrated best by a couple of quotes by Freire himself. In a classical move of the left, he accused the church of being the incarnation of evil, the devourer of souls, because it doesn't push his version of truth. For him, the church and educator have only one true purpose: to be a shepherd toward the upcoming political utopia. He said things like these: conversion to the people requires a profound rebirth. Those who undergo it must take on a new form of existence. They can no longer remain as they were. Only through comradeship with the oppressed can the converts understand their characteristic ways of living and behaving, which in diverse moments reflect the structure of domination. Without this mutual death and rebirth, education for freedom is impossible. In committing themselves to the oppressed, they begin a new period of apprenticeship. The sine qua non the apprenticeship demands is that, first of all, they really experience their own Easter, that they die as elitists so as to be resurrected the side of the unoppressed, that they be born again with the beings who were not allowed to be. This Easter, which results in the changing of consciousness, must be existentially experienced. The real Easter is not commemorative rhetoric. It is praxis. It is historical involvement. The old Easter of rhetoric is dead with no hope of resurrection. It is only in the authenticity of historical praxis that Easter becomes the death that makes life possible. But the bourgeois worldview, basically necrophiliac, death-loving, and therefore static, is unable to accept this supremely biophiliac, life-loving experience of Easter. The bourgeois mentality, which is far more than just a convenient abstraction, kills the profound historical dynamism of Easter and turns it into no more than a date on the calendar. The last example is feminism. Here we see the movement that has many different branches. It is important to point out that some of them are strictly enlightened, counter-collective, and anti-socialist. But because the dialectical worldview parasitizes movements and hides underneath borrowed language, it could form a distinct current alongside those that are liberal and then subvert them. And some of the biggest names in the business weren't liberal. For example, drawing as far as Virginia Woolf, we see deep inspirations from Marx. But the best start will be with Simone de Beauvoir, who readapted Hegelian Dialectic to frame relations between men and women. She stated that certain passages where Hegel's Dialectic describes the relationship of master to slave would apply far better to the relationship of man to woman. From that frame follows positioning sex as a category equivalent to capital, a dividing, privileging, and conflicting force, believing, as feminists do, that sex is a status category with political implications. This, of course, necessitates ideologies that legitimize the category, the ideologies that are caused by the very reason of Western type of thought that dichotomized categories into opposites. As always, ideologies serve oppression, violence, and exploitation. Those, in turn, form a system artificially and cynically constructed upon beliefs that condition us all. For example, we read, "It is clear that woman's whole character, her convictions, values, wisdom, morality, tastes, and behavior, is explained by her situation. As before, the structure built on the tracks prescribed by those ideologies imprison us. As with other movements, the spark of higher knowledge comes from subjective effects. Here themes of female intuition and sensuality are used as gnosis, allowing access to higher knowledge. The White Fathers told us, 'I think, therefore I am.' The Black Mother within each of us, the poet, whispers in our dreams, 'I feel, therefore I can be free.' Poetry coins the language to express and charter this revolutionary demand, the implementation of that freedom. Again, the most valid insight comes from the subjective experience of oppression we hear. When there is no connection at all between people, then anger is a way of bringing them closer together, of making contact. This gnosis needs again to be channeled by revealed knowledge. The theory and the movement, for example. One of the most affirming aspects of feminist movement has been the formation of an intellectual environment where there has been sustained dialectical critique and exchange. Hearing the voices of radical thinkers, among them the voices of women of color, the face of feminist theory and practice changed. There has been no other movement for social justice in our society that has been as self-critical as feminist movement. Feminist willingness to change direction when needed has been a major source of strength and vitality in feminist struggle. That internal critique is essential to any politics of transformation. Just as our lives are not fixed or static, but always changing, our theory must remain fluid, open, responsive to new information. The moral, religious work is again to be done by the negation of the order that imprisons us. Here were again used already mentioned concepts from black feminists, such as, master tools will never dismantle the master house. This meant to express that to build a new society, entirely new frame is required. Notice also that this means that they have no grasp of how the tools actually work. It is what you do with tools, not who made them, that makes them useful. Also, it meant that the new tools will be fashioned specifically to destroy the current structure of society. Now we remind ourselves that truth in this system means successful tactics, not correspondence to lower, tainted, prison-like reality. In the infamous statement by Kelly Oliver, it is not necessary to argue that feminist theory or feminist criticisms tell the truth without science. Rather, feminist theory ought to challenge our patriarchy's very conception of theory itself. I propose that in order to be revolutionary, feminist theory cannot claim to describe what exists, or natural facts. Rather, feminist theories should be political tools, strategies for overcoming oppression in specific concrete situations. The goal, then, of feminist theory should be to develop strategic theories, not true theories, not false theories, but strategic theories. Feminist theories can be conscious strategies with which to undermine and dissolve the oppressive strategy of patriarchy. As I have mentioned, feminism had many branches that grew in various directions. A moment ago, we described how it can be conceptualized when you focus on the distinction between biological sexes. However, from feminism, other currents grew that did similar things to gender and sexuality. One convenient point where we can trace that branching out is Simone de Beauvoir's claim about the nature of social prison. Her famous constructivist claim that one is not born, but rather becomes a woman, had profound consequences. She claimed that there is no rigorous biological distinction between the two sexes, so the depth of distinction must be socially constructed, serving to perpetuate male power and subordinate women to men's liking. She tried to use that accusation to place the locus of control on women's subjectivity. She most likely didn't anticipate the consequences this move would have. She probably thought, like many other feminists, that she could stop the slippery slope right there where it serves her the most. However, once you destabilize a category as arbitrary, you lose any moral ground to draw the line anywhere. And so, later theorists infused it with postmodern disdain for any claim of objectivity. They took it and ran further, trying to destabilize sex, sometimes even by comparing humans to vegetables. Now the term gender was coined. Previously, it mostly meant the linguistic distinction between words. Now it was said to encompass the whole set of expressions about sex, and as a construct it was proclaimed to be utterly detached from sex. Gender became what you do, how you behave, and how you present and express yourself. As a construct, it was wholly arbitrary, and it took the place of capital. Those privileged became those who performed gender in the way prescribed by society. It was therefore claimed that discrete genders are part of what humanizes individuals within contemporary culture. Indeed, we regularly punish those who fail to do their gender right. Now it was a goal of criticizing and subverting gender to destabilize the notion of the relation between sex and gender. If gender was a performance, the question becomes how to perform it critically to destabilize its meaning. Following claims were put forth. The idea that sexual practice has the power to destabilize gender emerged from my reading of Gail Rubin's The Traffic in Women and sought to establish that normative sexuality fortifies normative gender. Or, parody by itself is not subversive, and there must be a way to understand what makes certain kinds of parodic repetitions effectively disruptive, truly troubling, and which repetitions become domesticated and recirculated as instruments of cultural hegemony. And so, the idea of drag was coined. We hear that drag differs from other forms of gendered performance in its tendency to mock authority and challenge the status quo. After the philosophy was built up, it was now sliding down the constructivist slippery slope. We heard that the interconnected aspects of human biology, sex, gender, and sexuality now were fluently passing over and apart from one another. Each was pulled by a different current trying to use it in its mission of destabilization. Now, sexuality too was accused of being constructed and unattached to reproductive function. Here, sexuality deemed to be normal itself took the place of the Marxist capital as an alienating force. A new branch of so-called philosophy soon claimed that the very idea of the norm around sexuality is an expression of power, and therefore announced that everything excluded is unjustly marginalized, and whatever was marginalized by the system for then became sacred and in need to be recentered. The term queer was coined, initially meaning something weird and unfitting. Now it was subsuming every kind of deviancy in rapture with stability. Postmodern theories were used to do the heavy lifting, especially that of Michael Foucault, who claimed that insanity is just a social exclusion, and also, as you remember, tried to lower the age of consent in France. Queer and queerness became an analog to problematization or deconstruction. Queering comes to mean twisting, making things weird and unstable. Parody and performativity, drag, and queering now had a mission of destabilizing the very thing that is considered as a norm, because every norm is divisive, excluding, and simply put, sinful. Therefore, queer theory, which was rising since '80s, produced statements like these. I borrow from queer theory's insistence that queerness is that which undoes identity, not what holds it together. And the queerness of which I speak would deliberately sever us from ourselves, from the assurance, that is, of knowing ourselves, and hence of knowing our good. Such queerness proposes, in place of the good, something I want to call better, though it promises, in more than one sense of the phrase, absolutely nothing. And again, queerness offers the promise of failure as a way of life. And here I am obviously amending Foucault's formulation of homosexuality as friendship as a way of life. However alarming these quotes are, I guess you are not fully anticipating the depth queer theory is willing to go to attack every concept of what is normal. But we need to realize that if every norm is evil, the place you would go to harm the system most are the norms most sacred to it. In queer literature, we therefore hear quotes like the following. As a performative identity construct, childhood is produced and maintained through the rhetoric of protection, which justifies protective practices and policies. Understood as a purposeful social construct that emerged in a very specific cultural, historical, and political context, childhood innocence takes on greater significance as a durable medium for the perpetuation of white supremacy. The doctrine of innocence stands in the way of social justice work with children, which necessarily involves difficult knowledge. Queering entails the disruption of an entity by rejecting its categories, binaries, and norms. Our intention in this article is to encourage an active engagement with queering in child and youth care as a tool for critically examining the field and its understanding of sexualities, identities, difference, and development. We believe that queer theory, as an analytic approach, has a place in CIC in relation to developmentalist frameworks that are commonplace and taken for granted in the field. Queer theory can be helped in its desires to prove that children are capable of possessing complexity and sexuality by exploring work done in the fields of early childhood studies and sociological studies of childhood. New queer children's literature constructs children as decision makers, aware of their desire and deserving of respect and support. This is a far cry from the adultist, parent knows best logic that rationalizes constructing childhood as a time of innocence from sexual and other forms of adult knowledge. These children know what they want, and the queer-affirming family eschews their role of gender police and regulators of desire, which I suggest queers the family itself, along with conventional notions of children and childhood. And make no mistake, what you just heard is not some weird offshoot of queer theory. Statements like these are present in theory from the very beginning. In one of its founding papers, with over 7,500 citations, we read, "It is harder for most people to sympathize with actual boy lovers. Like communists and homosexuals in the 1950s, boy lovers are so stigmatized that it is difficult to find defenders for their civil liberties, let alone for their erotic orientation. Consequently, the police have feasted on them. Local police, the FBI, and watchdog postal inspectors have joined to build a huge apparatus whose sole aim is to wipe out the community of men who love underage youth. In 20 years or so, when some of the smoke has cleared, it will be much easier to show that these men have been the victims of a savage and undeserved witch hunt. A lot of people will be embarrassed by their collaboration with this persecution, but it will be too late to do much good for those men who have spent their lives in prison." After those frightening statements, I want you to take a deep breath. Remember that these are not isolated statements, but they serve a wider worldview. And by no means they are obscure. The Q, the queer from queer theory, is the same Q we know from LGBTQ+. I want you to remember what radicals needed to do to deal with the problem of reproduction, and what Herbert Marcuse called the Great Refusal. If people won't refuse the system on their own, we need to make them incompatible with this system, dysfunctional. Therefore, we read, "Building on psychological theories of motivation for collective action, we introduce a new individual difference measure of queer consciousness, defined as a politicized collective identity around sexual orientation. The Queer Consciousness Scale, QCS, consists of 12 items measuring 5 aspects of a politicized queer identity: sense of common fate, power discontent, system blame, collective orientation, and cognitive centrality." And at the end of talking about queer theory, after all the shocking statements we heard, I want you to see that even here, after 200 years after Hegel, this still is built like a religion. We still find quotes like these: "Queerness is not yet here. Queerness is an ideality. Put another way, we are not yet queer. We may never touch queerness, but we can feel it as the warm illumination of a horizon imbued with potentiality. We have never been queer, yet queerness exists for us as an ideality that can be distilled from the past and used to imagine a future. The future is queerness's domain. Queerness is a structuring and educated mode of desiring that allows us to see and feel beyond the quagmire of the present. The here and now is a prison house." All the developments we tracked produced many movements: feminism, queer theory, critical pedagogy, identity politics, and a grand amount of smaller theories that were taking any category and trying to frame real issues as a war against systemic oppression. Fat studies, disability studies, etc. Each theory was influential and powerful, but on its own, too small to take on the giant, the system. The last piece that was needed was how to organize all those different movements and direct them in a coordinated way against the system. In 1994, the term intersectionality was introduced. Its purpose was to map out all the vectors of oppression. It claimed to identify and assign a sort of currency of victimization to different forms of oppression. Now, the movements could cross-reference accrued grievances and be directed against a single source of it: systemic power. This tool became the purest and highest form of consciousness, the so-called critical consciousness that takes note of all and any disadvantages. An important stage in the development of political consciousness is reached when individuals recognize the need to struggle against all forms of oppression. Intersectionality theories, or the recognition of multiple interlocking identities defined by relative sociocultural power and privilege, constitute a vital step forward in research across multiple domains of inquiry. Intersectional theory openly stated that it blends neo-Marxist identity politics with postmodern theories. At the very end in the 2000s, that perspective was coined into a word we'd all heard: woke. Being woke became a simple slogan referring to the eyes of the convert being open to the eternal and ethereal forces of oppression. I was framing the entirety of our life and society as well as moral need to attack it. We define wokeness as critical consciousness to intersecting systems of oppression. Specifically, to be a woke person is to hold an unretractable embodied consciousness and political identity, acknowledging the oppression that exists in individual and collective experiences. If you ever thought that what you see at today's protest is a religious furry, you may not be wrong. The academia writes things like these. To be woke is not just a political ideology. It is an unretractable existence, a contradictory remedy of healing and pain, the cultivation of a deep and necessary consciousness of survival that slices white patriarchal supremacy and wounds the heart, opening minds. Our eyes never shut. Our voices never cease. We are courageous, we are fierce, we are exhausted. And yet we persist. We are alive. We are here. We are woke. One of the astonishing things about the spread of this ideology is how unaware we are of what is happening. Take, for example, the concept of liberalism. Many people today, frightened by what is happening, think the cause is the rot of liberalism. Of course, liberalism has its faults, but most of the protests, woke campaigns, and weird claims are made by movements explicitly opposed to liberalism. They only camouflage as it. We are so confused that we can't even distinguish between liberalism and leftism. We don't know that dialecticians began as leftists who countered the very idea of Enlightenment and liberalism, promoting mystic romanticism and collectivism instead. To this day, their descendants still viciously and openly proclaim their opposition to liberalism. A second weird development is how unaware we are of its popularity. Today, critical theory is implemented extremely widely in academia, parasitizing almost every sociological discipline and spreading ever wider. Postmodernists are among the most cited people on the planet. Educational theorist Paulo Freire was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, and his theories are instituted as dogma in most teaching colleges. The social emotional learning program, an outgrowth of his ideas, is the basis for education in tens of thousands of schools. Even UNESCO is proposing a plan for global education in which they explicitly call for the realization of Herbert Marcuse's revolution and the rewriting of the mission of each intellectual institution. In a previous video, I already mentioned the Fabian Society, which, under the banner of a wolf in sheep's clothing, influenced the British Labour Party and the London School of Economics. Religion suffered immensely when it was parasitized by liberation theology. One of its fervent promoters, Cardinal Helder Camara, known as the Red Bishop, was a known communist and a supporter of the Maoist Cultural Revolution. He was a friend of Pope Paul VI and held similar beliefs on social justice to the current Pope Francis. His thought was influential to Jeremiah Wright, Barack Obama's pastor. The chairman of the World Economic Forum, Klaus Schwab, described meeting him as a crucial moment in his life. We have heard many claims from the W.E.F. about the infiltration of government's cabinets and their plan for the Great Reset. The slogan, "Build Back Better," has been repeated by political and spiritual leaders worldwide. After 2008, the opportunity arose to use the crisis as a symptom of broken system that only their theory can save. As the only remedy, a new doctrine was proposed and put into practice. Scores like ESG, CSR, and soon SDG were introduced to limit the free market and direct it toward a new moral and sustainable stakeholder economy. Today, more than $35 trillion are managed under the ESG collar alone. Almost every company now has diversity, equity, and inclusion departments. We have arts infected by ideology, where commissars dictate what is the correct amount of each ethnicity, disability, or sexuality that should be on screen to be considered a legitimate story for Oscars. Worse still, medical schools and hospitals are captured too. Even STEM needs diversity officers telling them which conclusions are moral and which are not. Each year we held a Pride Month, which some propose should already be renamed to Pride Season. This is the longest celebration in our whole calendar, overtaking even the birth of Jesus. We have flags representing various sexualities plastered over our capitals and government buildings. Most performers and sportsmen must do the racial work. Today we hear the dialectic whenever progressive plans or holistic education is mentioned. We hear it when we are instructed to negate culture, problematize it, decolonize, and accuse of racism, sexism, etc. To address the growing weight of this worldview on us, I am trying to explain the ideology behind it in a series of videos. However, the explanations are only a portion of what I want to do. The quotes I have been showing are from the website I built. This website maps the worldview so that it can be better conceptualized. I am cataloging their theory to prevent them from gaslighting us. I present each idea in easily accessible quotes so you can withstand manipulation without reading a library of gibberish on every topic. Secondly, because their ultimate motive is to practice a theory, each idea is also provided with a catalog of examples that demonstrate how it spreads into the real world. On the homepage, you have a list of freshly added examples from all ideas. The website allows everyone to add quotes or examples to the database. The more comprehensive our catalog of their plan, the better we can address it. The current stage of the website is intended to help you orient yourself in the chaos produced by them, but it is also the first stage of taking action, making activists accountable for their games. The structure of the website is built in a way that allows for flipping between theory and practice. If you choose to support me, I can add a subsequent dimension where every person can post a claim, and Snakeology will pair you with lawyers specializing in litigations regarding the given topic. Furthermore, each institution and idea cataloged will gain the ability to open forums and groups so that users can work together to solve the problems they face. An extensive catalog of their practice will allow me to map the extent to which they have subverted our institutions and branches of the economy and culture. With that knowledge, I will be able to build a metric score showing how deeply each institution supports or subverts core Western values, such as valuing merit over skin color or free speech over hate speech. Lastly, I will provide for each idea reiteration in defense of the values it contests. This plan aims to lower the cost of standing up against their theoretical claims by organizing and making their claims digestible. Secondly, I hope to simplify the channel toward lawful action. Additionally, I hope that the growth of the catalog will provide a useful resource database for building arguments, research, and claims against this ideology. I have listened to and admired the work of many people like James Lindsay, sifting through this activist theory. I strongly recommend his and others' work because they are mining some really valuable material. What I want to do here is forge this raw material of the theory into actionable tools. So now, back to dialectic. Here's a place where I get opinionated and try to express my thoughts about what this thing that festers in academia and spills into our culture really is. The first question is then, why does it spread? The first reason I believe is that most rigorous scientists believe we dealt with alchemy centuries ago and don't even suspect that it may have survived. While we all know the divide between humanities and hard sciences, most people don't anticipate that the rift is bigger than it needs to be. Second, many scholars and scientists simply want to do their job. When someone bores engineers with diversity issues, they are often willing to accept everything if only the administration lets them go back to their work. On the other hand, in social sciences, many people simply use axioms like conflict theory as long-established truths and don't bother to look into its dialectical history and let many things slide. And the third reason is that in the rest of academia, there are actual believers. People who bought wholesale into the theory and push it. And I use the word believers intentionally because I think we have proven enough that it is a religious structure. From here, the rot spreads because, as we know, the goal of alchemy is not truth but success. In academia, many disciplines are rather willing to use logic and evidence to deduce what was assumed rather than induct the information from the evidence. Ironically, many disciplines were transformed into exactly what postmodernists were obsessing about, a corrupt system of laundering politics as truth. Let's start with the discursive newer model. What is wrong with the theory? Well, the easy thing to point out is that they are motivated only by power. We only need to take them at their word when they say that truth is meaningless and only narrative power games count. That one is obvious and should be enough. But let's put power aside and focus on the claim that every statement is only a part of the narrative. That is an interesting point because if we think about it, both discourses and dialectics are linguistic theories. We know that they may claim to describe natural or social reality, but at their core, they are all about language. Now, if we think about it, the whole structure of dialectic is kind of organized like a story structure. We have a thesis and antithesis, just like we have a hero and an antagonist. We have a holistic perspective, just like we have every character immersed in the setting and overall tone of the story. We have dialectical progress, just like we have a plot. We have conflict theory and qualitative change, just like we have a story rising to a climax. We have a resolution, just like we have a word offen. Both resolve the story and set the plot on new ground. Characters are transformed, more experienced, sometimes wounded, but overall achieved and enriched. I cannot help but to smile when parallels mount. Dialectical triad and Freytag's pyramid, story structures, and dialectical progress structures, or the Hegelian circle of circles and the hero's journey. If we remember that the goal of alchemy is not truth but operational success, what would that mean for linguistic theory that camouflages as science? My answer is to be believable and convincing. And so, the spin doctors of philosophy naturally learned similar tricks as storytellers, only they had to dress it in a different language that will pass in academia. And to make it even funnier, the ways that academics try to pass it off as knowledge drifts even to the same diagrams like epicicles in the geocentric system that were used to mask fundamentally bad assumptions. This is what I really think dialectic as a worldview really does. It doesn't explain anything. It describes, it retells. It is a story. Just like the geocentric model, it uses an overblown technical system to mask that the fundamental assumptions are wrong. The drama makes it believable but not true. Remember when the Francis Bacon and Enlightenment rejected dramatization as a clouding of judgment? The alchemist's mind is bent on results, not truth. For him, the narrative is very useful. The suggestive, manipulative effect of dramatization serves him well to mask a lack of understanding. To conceal a lack of knowledge, dialecticians need to move you away from the natural world into the world of speculations, linguistic projection, and holistic pictures. Contact with reality is maintained mostly through emotional and dramatized channels like pathos and criticism, making you angry at what is, so you would be ready to abandon it and live in what can be imagined. Dialectical reason for me is the difference between explaining, when you look from inside out, to the outside in. Dialectic looks at the result of the process and bakes an explanation about it that is presentable, but it doesn't understand the process that caused the effect, so it can never control or recreate it. It rather anthropomorphizes events and forms a narrative. Before the theory of evolution, we had a story about the creation of animals. It was believable and widespread, but it was never even close to true. I find it ironic that Hegel himself said it the best: the owl of Minerva flies only at dusk, meaning that wisdom comes only after things have already come to pass. If you think about it, at no moment in history did the dialectical theory help to solve any specific problem, but many times it helped to convince people to listen. But after gaining power, they never could do what they promised because they never actually understood the process they were playing with. Only after things have already happened, they can frame it as part of the story. Think, for example, about any technical problem, any disease. Can you imagine how the story of clash of man and nature and the rising pandemic of the Black Death motivated people to do research and find the cure? Yes, you can imagine it. But did it happen, as dialectic tells? No. Medicine was needed for thousands of years and in hundreds of countries, and in almost all of them, even the death of whole cities and nations didn't produce the spark that would elevate the population from misery. Only where there was actual science did it actually produce results. Science, which from the beginning rejected drama as a thing clouding judgment. This is at last part of the answer to why this ideology spreads outside academia. It spreads because people don't need to know the theory. They need to know the story that frames categories as sinful and divisive. Then it accuses the whole system of plotting to reinforce categories for the purpose of oppression. From here, the alchemical model of feelings, that hidden gold, the inner knowledge of truth comes in. A person can simply state that they just kind of feel what is right, and also that the solution is already here, they feel it. We just need to lift up the oppressive elements of the system to let it flourish. And lastly, the story says that to do that, you just need to attack every norm, which here is framed as healing the divide. When this train goes full speed, and when anyone tries to stop it, only now is the time for theory and academia to swoop in and dismantle the brakes. You want to say that there is a difference between man and woman? No. Academics have already proven that gender is only a patriarchal social construct designed to marginalize. Here is a ton of theory based on linguistic acrobatics. So, this narrative feature, alongside the lust for power, is for me the biggest flaw within the theory. But now I want to look at smaller and more specific problems of dialectic. First, it presumes to have a higher, elevated understanding. The reason, the Vernunft or Gnosis, but it doesn't. No one has. What poses as a higher perspective is a misconception that you are the one crafting the world's story and know where the plot goes. No one knows. The best thing we have is to precisely watch and measure what is, to gain some knowledge and mastery over where we are. Science, while not a magical solution, is the best one we have. In contrast to dialectical methods, science doesn't claim to know the future, but it can make good predictions and is held accountable to it, based on knowledge and proof. In contrast to dialectic, it can do more than only rationalize after the fact. While it doesn't tell you who we should choose as the leader, it lets you predict how far the bullet will fly, how much weight the bridge will carry, and how to lift the rocket to the moon.
Planes fly, cars drive, computers compute.
It's an inductive argument.
If you base medicine on science, you cure people. If you base the design of planes on science, they fly. If you base the design of rockets on science, they reach the moon. It works, bitches.
Now, that is an important point because no one who claims to have this special sight should be treated as a scientist. Not least because they are in contradiction to what science claims to be. But those who think they see the reasons behind the reasons of reality will inevitably try to take control of every discipline and gear it to their own revealed purpose. In essence, parasite them. The second trick is that of elevation. As you remember, we had the word obver, the phoenix-like elevation from the ashes of the fire of negation. Well, that is just alchemy. That is literally magic. Let's not waste time on that. But let's point out how this alchemical trick was pulled. This mysterious joining applied to linguistic statements. You can blend statements that way because they don't have material boundaries. Reality does. When they switched from language to nature, they transported the linguistic trick to the reality that is governed by quite different laws than imagination. Also, the very concept that you are elevating something was a misleading twist of language, a metaphor that was treated seriously. We have ways of assessing overlapping sets. We don't need to say that the part overlapping is a magical transformation. Thank you very much. But Hegel did. Now there is another important point to be made here. This elevation is fueled by negation. It is very important, especially with regard to so many examples of the religious structure of this system. There is something called negative theology. It basically says that there is no way to comprehend God by stating what he is. He is unimaginable for us and always insufficient to grasp the entirety of his perfection. But we can get closer to it by discarding those statements that we know are insufficient to describe him. The dialectical negation, Marxist criticism and struggle, postmodern deconstruction, problematization, queering, and all the relentless accusations of racism, sexism, colonialism, bias, phobias, and hate are built on a similar premise. Activists don't know how to do things correctly. The image of a future just and free society is indescribable. But they know which parts of society don't fit that picture. Parts that don't center their subjectivity, parts that don't put power in their hands. And lastly, on the point of synthesis, because the dialectician doesn't actually understand how to solve the problem, they just blend and shift boundaries and descriptions. What they produce is never an actual solution, more an organic consequence. It is always a synthetic blend they want to sell as an improvement. Their goals always have fake projections that they try to demand we pretend are real. We see it with trans men and trans women. All the activists do is shout the slogan at us and demand we accept synthetic as real. The same with anti-racism. Does anyone actually think that any diversity training that they subject people to and accuse of white fragility is actually healing? No. What about quotas in politics and companies? Affirmative action? Are they just democratic or reflect actual achievements? Also no. These are the same as a central economy and 5-year plans, but on a smaller scale. All those solutions are forced and fake, and they hurt just like an implant would. The next trick is about not seeing another dimension, but reaching it. While the alchemists and hermetics believed in something that was supernatural, we tend to think that social alchemists don't. But this is not true. The trick is that they don't describe a higher dimension as having magical laws like Harry Potter or Star Wars. They paint the picture with the same laws and furnish it with the shapes we have in this reality. And they just call them possibilities because it looks familiar. But it's not. It is as fictional as Mission Impossible. Imagine that you would propose that you have a system where every person, literally, every person in the world jumps at a specific time. It is conceivable, but that is not possible. It is fiction. Or imagine that you have a bucket of grains of sand in different colors. If you throw it up in the air, the dust could fall to form a picture of the Mona Lisa. Well, it theoretically could, it is possible in our imagination. But it won't. Similarly, just because their model overlooks the facts of competition and reward, of scarcity and availability, of trust and misunderstandings, and it is conceivable to imagine such words, it doesn't make it possible. It is fantasy, and it won't happen if you say it convincingly enough. We can't choose the processes that govern reality. We can only learn them. The next trick is the one I believe is the easiest to lure people into adopting the theory. Because dialectic claims to be a study of the unity between opposites, the state in which opposites persist is, by definition, wrong and impure. Here, the trick is to place the moral sin on the fact of distinction. Now, the only thing people need to do is to decry marginalization, exclusion, and difference as oppressive, regardless of the cause. We see a great example of this in arguments that the disparity between salaries in men's and women's sports is due to discrimination. This feature of ideology, however, has far deeper consequences. Categories and distinctions are the very functions our brains evolved to do. Different situations require different reactions. Without comprehending the distinctions, we are doomed. In the broad picture, we can say that the failure of all dialecticians who have put their hands on power is because of this inversion, where they see the dialectic as a spiral that lifts us above artificial distinction. It is far more like a vortex that with every destroyed distinction severed us from concepts and that we use to comprehend and master reality. And the vortex is dragging us down, lower and lower back, down the levels of development that lifted us up from nature. What they see at the end of history, freedom as a state where all boundaries were erased, is a great example of fool's gold. This is dangerous nonsense. Most of the things in the world require the ability to build or practice them. For them, that confusion of freedom with entitlement and lack of pressure is what destroys the very ability to get the things we need. Freedom turns into entropy, the free fall that imagines there is no bottom to hit. The next trick regards holistic arguments and perspectives. Dialectical theory says that when negating something, you look at it from the perspective of the entire movement of the system. In practice, it means that you can always change the subject to something bad because everything is a result of systemic forces. You can accuse anything of anything because it is in the same system. As long as the thing you accuse is not attacking what you want, it can be said it supports the evils of the system. You can use it to liquidate any claim and redirect the conversation to your vision of what should be the point of the system. The last trick is the one we have seen many times in the video: praxis, or putting theory into practice. For Marxists, truth is a tactic that brings them closer to utopia. It can be an argument or an action. Each can be changed to get there faster. The obviously dishonest aspect here is that they don't hold themselves accountable for what they propose or for what they do. With every failure when they hold power, the practice is wrong. With every failure to gain power, the theory is wrong. So, which is in the driver's chair? My personal belief is that the answer is neither. The answer is that it has always been about the tactics, the pattern of behavior, and the personality traits that look for an excuse to be unleashed. Just like Nietzsche said, philosophers frequently employ their philosophical systems as justifications for their own personal pathologies, projecting their desires and weaknesses onto their intellectual constructs, presenting them as universal truths. To me, the source of this worldview is a motivated reasoning that only uses high theory as a laundering mechanism to make rationalizations for things that are not acceptable and functioning in civil society. I sense a narcissism in the belief that one can comprehend the direction of laws of progress and the end of history itself, even if one lacks ways to describe it. I sense it in the self-congratulatory model of alchemical emotions, the conviction that the hidden and repressed subjectivities are good and pure just in themselves if only allowed to be released. This emotionality, coded by rationalizations, is just a triumph of emotionality over reason. In this worldview, the inner feelings of disappointment and discomfort are treated as an actual evil, and the lived experience presumes competence about the problem. It becomes revealed knowledge, it becomes gnosis. And just like gold and lead, that subjectivity trapped by the constraints of the cynical system that denies us something breeds unending entitlement. I see the ultimate narcissism in the picture of human this theory holds, one who externalizes his subjectivity by transforming the world in his image. To me, this is a great narcissistic solipsism, the godlike complex, the belief that to be truly human is to transform reality in your image. This picture of man is one of infinite pride that bends everything towards self, placed at the center of the universe. As long as this view holds, other human qualities like duty, care, loyalty, self-limiting, constraint, sacrifice, preservation, reliability, trust, compromise, admiration, learning from others, respect, and perhaps most important of all, forgiveness and gratitude, are denigrated to second-hand qualities. Worse still, they can be interpreted as a force of evil, a force that holds us where we are locked in a lower dimension, preventing purification, movement up, the force that conserves the status quo. I see narcissism in the idea of true consciousness, in the belief that you have access to some hidden and higher truth that lets you look behind the veil of reality and comprehend its ultimate nature. This consciousness frames the believer as a craftsman of historical progress, calls to complete the plan of the absolute, and deliver historical judgment on behalf of progress. I see psychopathology in this anger, hostility, and inability to comprehend the purpose of institutions and norms if they don't serve the self at every moment, sort of an extreme Chesterton fence. This view of society, fundamentally as a prison, as a barricade that bars us from something better. This constant and overwhelming feeling of being trapped, constrained, manipulated, and oppressed whenever you don't have your way. The cynicism toward every norm as fake, arbitrary, and meaningless, as a social construct, mere ideology and a power game. A view of society as a battlefield of groups, of constant clashes, and a theater of eternal predation. I see it in the lashing out, dramatization, and demonization of each aspect of the system by exaggerated accusations of persecution on the systemic levels. And the feeling of impotence, inability to do anything because we are molded, socialized, and constructed by the system. The feeling is similar to pagan beliefs of humans as just playthings of the gods, gods who here are systemic and structural forces. I see Machiavellianism in the use of linguistic methods that try to supplant the stable and objective methods. The insistence that we should use methods that are open to twists of tongue, abstract transformations of concepts, and meaning of words. Methods that thrive on interpretations that rely on constant references to the authority of the one with higher understanding. I see power hunger and Machiavellian inclinations in the idea of gained true consciousness. The belief that only a few can see the reasons and causes invisible to others, and that gives them the right to redirect and shape systems according to this subjective vision. I see it in those leaders, movements, and intellectuals who become essentially prophets and shepherds. They, as a true parasite, denigrate all others that don't share this vision as having a lower understanding trapped in a world of artificial illusions. It gives them a right to repurpose things and take control over their direction. Comedy, art, engineering, medicine, education, politics, and science. I see it in the idea of rising consciousness, with the objective of making people believe what you want them to see. The idea of confining them to your narrow and dogmatic interpretation of reality as a battleground of cynical interests. Machiavellianism is at the center of the idea that only power counts, that everything is a power game, a cynical narrative, a tactical move to get influence in this war of conflicting groups and identities. Above all, Machiavellianism is visible in praxis. The idea that you will twist words in any way necessary to get what you need, to get power. And it is in the idea that you will do anything necessary to realize its ends, motivations, and theory. We see it in all those proclamations of necessity of transformation of a long march through institutions, of subversion of culture and education, and most terrifyingly in Herbert Marcuse's idea of changing people at a biological dimension, so they will become psychologically dysfunctional and reject the system. We see it carried out in the ideas of queer theory that proclaims queer as the very definition of disintegration of stability and norms. These are to me clear signs of this condition. I sense sadism in the idea that the world is a battleground of groups, in which one is oppressed. Here their righteousness and justice are motivated by pain and anger. We see it in pathos that announces that the true meaning of conflict is felt, experienced, and it opens eyes to the truth of reality. This ideology feeds on negative emotions and entitlement and channels them to negate the status quo. The careless process of negation, criticism, struggle, deconstruction, and problematization takes these drives of resentment, envy, revenge, and uses them to attack the system. In a sadistic way, it proclaims justice in ruthless criticism of everything that exists. This work of Karlist destruction is pathologically interpreted as purifying and called healing and uniting. This anger and hostility promise to destroy things in categories that divide, marginalize, and oppress, and therefore proclaim fury and vengeance as virtues of peace, unity, and humanization. Worse still, it rages with indignation and proclaims itself to be a judge. It sees society as constructed where everyone is tainted by structures of socialization and therefore guilty. Like a terrifying doctrine of one drop of blood, it believes in collective and extended complicity. It drives relentlessly to squeeze out the confession before the theory can deliver its unforgiving historical judgment. I think it is very important to see that this theory inverts good and bad. It misplaces things we value in spaces where we would have things we disapprove of. It remolds the low instincts in place of actual virtues and describes actual virtues as pernicious biases. It reverses breaking to healing. It proclaims pity and compassion only when it focuses on power to mobilize those disenfranchised. But it never tries to reach a compromised peace, and certainly never shows forgiveness and mercy without first securing utter subjugation. It uses solidarity and community only as a collective force, a battering ram, and a human shield. We see it in Mao sending the Red Guard to work in fields when they wanted his power back. We see it in the Black Lives Matter organization who, on the body of George Floyd, collected millions of dollars only for the founder to buy themselves multiple mansions. We see it in queer theory that uses gays and lesbians when they accuse of homophobia those who reject changing terms like pedophile to minor attracted person or object to pornographic books in schools. We can hear similar systems of error disintegration echo through history. In mass delusions and culture-bound syndromes I mentioned in the first video, in pirate codes which echo revolutionary proclamations of equality, fraternity, and liberty, and in virtue signaling that resembles biblical Pharisee praying in public. I believe that the theory is only a riverbed that gathers all those inclinations and directs them to its own end. That is why I think it is also so dangerous, because it preys on our best instincts of tolerance, compassion, and decency. It can make decent people believe and act out bad things. People swallow it because they buy into the story without knowing the theory beneath. Worse still, many people are unable to orient themselves as the process of destabilization, psychological as well as institutional, is well on its way. To solve this conundrum, we need to understand the theory, but not be obsessed with it. As long as they believe in praxis, the theory will twist tactically. That is why when I map this worldview, I focus on things that explain what they do, not what it could mean on paper if the theory was reality and truth. Either way, they frequently and willingly contradict themselves. For now, many institutions are rotten. It will not end until academia is not cleaned up, just like we had to clean it of phrenology and eugenics. To see who is honestly trying to address the problem, I find it best to see who is pretending that it is just about a theory, who is dismissing volumes of pernicious statements, and who is willing to admit that whole disciplines turn to a political worldview and activism. As long as we argue with them on theoretical ground, they are left to unaccountably push the practice.
Behold, this is the hole of the tarantula. Do you want to see the tarantula itself? Here hangs its web. Touch it so that it trembles. There it comes willingly. Welcome, tarantula. Your triangle and symbol sits black on your back. And I also know what sits in your soul. Revenge sits in your soul. Wherever you bite, black scabs grow. Your poison makes the soul whirl with revenge. Thus I speak to you in a parable. You who make souls whirl, you preachers of equality. To me you are tarantulas and secretly vengeful. But I shall bring your secrets to light. Therefore I laugh in your faces with my laughter of the heights. Therefore I tear at your webs, that your rage may lure you out of your lie holes, and your revenge may leap out from behind your word, justice. For that man be delivered from revenge, that is for me the bridge to the highest hope and a rainbow after long storms. The tarantulas, of course, would have it otherwise. What justice means to us is precisely that the world be filled with the storms of our revenge. Thus they speak to each other. We shall wreak vengeance and abuse on all whose equals we are not. Thus do the tarantula hearts vow. And will to equality shall henceforth be the name for virtue. And against all that has power, we want to raise our clamor. You preachers of equality, the tyrannomania of impotence clamors thus out of you for equality. Your most secret ambitions to be tyrants thus shroud themselves in words of virtue. Aggrieved conceit, repressed envy, perhaps the conceit and envy of your fathers, erupt from you as a flame and as the frenzy of revenge. What was silent in the Father speaks in the Son, and I often found the Son the unveiled secret of the Father. They are like enthusiasts, but it is not the heart that fires them, but revenge. And when they become elegant and cold, it is not the spirit, but envy that makes them elegant and cold. Their jealousy leads them even on the paths of thinkers. And this is the sign of their jealousy. They always go too far, till their weariness must in the end lie down to sleep in the snow. Out of every one of their complaints sounds revenge. In their praise there is always a sting, and to be a judge seems bliss to them. But thus I counsel you, my friends, mistrust all in whom the impulse to punish is powerful. They are people of a low sort and stock. The hangman and the bloodhound look out of their faces. Mistrust all who talk much of their justice. Verily, their souls lack more than honey, and when they call themselves the good and the just, do not forget that they would be Pharisees if only they had power. My friends, I do not want to be mixed up and confused with others. Some preach my doctrine of life and are at the same time preachers of equality and tarantulas. Although they are sitting in their holes, these poisonous spiders, with their backs turned on life, they speak in favor of life, but only because they wish to hurt. They wish to hurt those who now have power, for among those, the preaching of death is still most at home. If it were otherwise, the tarantulas would teach otherwise. They themselves were once the foremost slanderers of the world and burners of heretics. I do not wish to be mixed up and confused with these preachers of equality.